10 metric tons of food in the basement isn't wealth. It's bait for anyone stronger than you. And right now, literally everyone is stronger than you. That's what a man thinks who has just woken up in a stranger's body in the middle of a dead city and realized that his system gave him a warehouse, but forgot to give him an army. 300 fighters available. 0. Unlock condition. Seize the territory or die. His name is Daniel Cross, 29 years old. He ran a logistics hub near Cincinnati until a nighttime highway sent a guardrail crashing through his windshield. And you know what he thought in the last second before the impact? Not about God, not about his family. He thought that tomorrow's inventory. Typical Dan. Even as he's dying, he's counting inventory. And now he opens his eyes on the cold concrete of a wrecked gas station. His left arm is numb all the way up to his shoulder. Somewhere, water is dripping into a tin can. The smell of burnt rubber, mold, and a sickly sweet rot, the kind that makes your stomach churn, assaults his nose. The body feels foreign, skinny. His collarbones stick out so far you could hang a jacket on them. His voice sounds higher, younger. Dan sits up. His head is spinning. This body hasn't been dead for a week, or maybe longer. He feels around in his pockets, empty. No phone, no money, no keys, nothing from his past life. And right then, a blue window flashes before his eyes. Ruler's starter kit activated. Food, 10 metric tons. Underground arsenal. System army, 300 units. Available, 0. Unlock condition, territory capture. Dan blinks. He stares at it for 10 seconds. Then he does the only thing a logistics manager knows how to do in the face of chaos. He opens a new file in his head. Location unknown, resources unconfirmed, staff, 0 people, priority, food and water, the rest can wait. He stands up. He's reeling, but he keeps going. Behind an overturned refrigerator, a hatch with a combination lock is hidden in the floor. The system prompts 4 digits. The lock clicks. 12 concrete steps lead down, and there they are. Rows of green army crates, flour, rice, beans, powdered milk, salt, sugar, medicines, seeds, 10 metric tons. Dan's knees buckle, not from weakness, from the sheer scale of it. 10 metric tons is 5,000 person days on a full ration, 20,000 on a half ration. The numbers jump out at him. That's his language. And in the far corner are long, narrow crates. Rifles, pistols, ammunition, marked National Guard. Dan doesn't touch them. He doesn't know how to shoot. Not yet. And right now, that's not the point. Here's the point. 10 metric tons of food without people isn't a resource. It's bait for anyone stronger. And right now, everyone is stronger. He needs people. Dan stands up. He closes the hatch. He moves the refrigerator back. He sits down by the entrance, facing the street. He places a stack of crackers and a water bottle next to him. And he waits. 40 minutes later, the first one creeps along the wall. A guy, skinny, barefoot. He's not walking in the center, but close to the wall, the way people who are used to hiding walk. He spots Dan. He freezes. His eyes dart from the crackers to Dan's face. He's sizing him up to see if he can take them. Dan doesn't move. He just asks calmly, "What's your name? How old are you? What did you used to do?" The guy blinks. They don't ask for names here. Here, you either take what's offered or run. Malik, 16, helped his dad at the auto repair shop. Dan holds out a cracker and a canteen and says flatly, without a hint of threat, "There's work. It's not for free. Food, water, a roof over your head." "I agree." Malik takes a bite, chews, looks for a catch, then nods. "You're first. You'll be the mechanic. Sit down and wait. More will come." By noon, there's 7 of them. Malik, the mechanic. Frank, a 52-year-old former farmer. Ruth, a nurse. Tyrone, a strong and silent porter. Patty is a mother of 2 children who are hiding in the ruins 3 blocks away. Leo is a student who can read and write, which is already a luxury around here. And last to arrive is Knox, wiry, crooked nose. He says, "I don't know how to do anything useful, but I can fight." Dan asks 3 questions. How many people are in your gang? Where are they stationed? Who's the boss? Knox answers without hesitation. 12, 2 blocks south. The boss goes by the nickname Willie. Dumb, but strong. Dan nods. "You're the head of security now. Your job isn't to fight, but to make sure no one gets close without warning." Knox stares for a long time. Then he says, "That sounds like a real job." It is a real job. Rations, a roof over your head, people under your command. But steal even 1 cracker from the storeroom, and you're out. I won't beat you. I won't kill you. You'll just be out. For good. Knox smiles for the first time. By evening, everything is in full swing. Malik is patching the roof and reinforcing the door. Frank and Tyrone are hauling the day's ration upstairs. Ruth is sorting through the medications. Patty is baking the first flatbreads over the fire in a tin bucket. Leo is writing down names and ages on the consumption quota log, the new administration's first document. Knox is on the roof, looking down both sides of the street. And then the system flashes again. Take over the block. A 300-meter radius. The reward? 50 system fighters, a metric ton of supplies. Dan looks at it. 300 meters is 4 houses on each side, plus yards, plus alleys. Anyone could be hiding in any of them with a gun. No intel, no map. He has 7 men, 2 of whom are too weak to fight. 1 former gangster with his bare hands, and himself, who can't take a single blow. But 50 fighters change everything. With them, you can sleep at night. You can think about tomorrow. Dan approaches Knox. He speaks quietly. I need to know what's within a 300-meter radius. Every house, every basement, every rat. By dawn. Knox replies, it's dangerous to go out at night. I know. That's why I'm asking you and not someone else. Knox is silent for 3 seconds. He nods. He disappears into the darkness. And here it is. The first night. The first ration. 7 names on the list. 1 warehouse behind a manhole cover. And a manager sitting on an upside-down crate, counting. Calories per person. Days until the smell of food draws the guests. Chances of surviving until morning. The results are lousy so far. But Dan has always worked with lousy results. He turned the warehouse near Cincinnati around in 8 months with a leaky roof and negative metrics across the board. The stakes are higher here. It's not a bonus at stake here. It's lives. 7 so far. More coming soon. Knox returned 2 hours before dawn. Quiet as a cat. Wet with dew. With a broken knuckle on his right hand. He sat down across from Dan and began to speak. 4 houses on the left side of the street. 2 were empty. In the third, a family, a man, a woman, and 3 children, had barricaded themselves on the second floor. In the fourth, 2 guys, young, nervous. One had a knife. The other had something that looked like a sawed-off shotgun, but Knox wasn't sure. On the right side, 3 houses. The first was half collapsed. In the second, an old man, barely alive. The third is empty, but a stash of tools was found in the basement. Hammers, wrenches, a coil of wire, a hacksaw. Everything's rusty, but still usable. Dan listened without interrupting. When Knox finished, he asked one question. The 2 guys with the knife and the sawed-off shotgun. Are they from Willie's gang? Knox shook his head. No, they're loners, operating on their own. They hold their territory by themselves. Willie's gang is further away, 2 blocks to the south. There are 12 of them. They haven't ventured this far yet because, until yesterday, there was nothing to take at the gas station. Dan nodded. Until yesterday. Now there's something to take, so we don't have much time. He woke up Malik and Tyrone. He explained the plan. First up, the family on the second floor. No assault, negotiations. Dan would go alone, with food but no weapons. Tyrone would stand by downstairs in case anything went wrong. Malik would stay at the gas station and watch the entrance. Dawn broke, hazy and yellow. Dan grabbed 2 packs of crackers and a water bottle and headed for the third house on the left side of the street. It was a 2-story brick house. The first floor windows were boarded up. On the second floor, someone's eye flashed through a crack between the boards and vanished immediately. Dan stopped on the sidewalk. He raised his hand so they could see he was holding only food, and he spoke, loudly, calmly, without a threat. He said his name was Dan, that he lived at the gas station across the street, that he had food and work, that he wasn't forcing anyone, he was just making an offer. Crackers and water right now, a daily ration if they agreed to work. Silence. A long one. Then a voice rang out from above. A man's voice. Hoarse. Angry. He asked what the hell Dan wanted, what kind of work it was, and whether he was a human trafficker. Dan replied calmly. Not a trafficker, a manager. He needed workers, to fix the roof, to put up walls, to carry water. Regular work, for food and shelter. If they don't like it, they can leave at any time. No penalties. Another pause. Then a bolt rattled. The door on the first floor opened slightly. A man stepped out, about 40 years old, bearded, thin to the point of transparency. Behind him in the doorway, a woman loomed, holding a child in her arms. 2 older children huddled at her feet. The man looked at the crackers in Dan's hands, then at Tyrone, who was standing 20 paces behind him, then back at Dan, and he said one word. Show me. Dan held out the crackers. The man took one, broke it in half, sniffed it, took a bite, chewed slowly. His expression didn't change, but his eyes grew moist. He turned to his wife and nodded. She came out with the children. The youngest looked about 3 years old, skinny as a baby bird, huge eyes on a tiny face. The man's name was Curtis. His wife's name was Rachel. Their children were Tommy, Annie, and little Sam. Before the gray year, Curtis had worked on a construction site. He knew how to lay bricks and weld rebar. Rachel knew how to sew. In the wasteland, that meant she could mend clothes and stitch up wounds. Dan wrote down their names. He added them to the list. Now there were 12 people, counting the children. Next were 2 guys with a knife and a sawed-off shotgun. Dan handled them differently. He sent Knox, not to fight, to talk. Knox knew how to speak the language that people with knives understand. He explained it simply. The gas station now has a boss. The boss has food. The boss won't mess with you. You won't mess with him. If you want to work, come on in. If you don't, sit quietly. But if you try to take anything without asking, you'll be met not by one skinny guy, but by 10 men with tools. 10 was an exaggeration. Dan had 4 men capable of fighting, counting himself. But bluffing is a standard tool in negotiations. Dan used it in every other meeting with suppliers. The guys thought it over. They showed up 3 hours later. One was named Victor. The other was Cole. Both were young. Both were angry. Both were hungry. The sawed-off shotgun turned out to be broken. It didn't even fire, just a scare tactic. Dan didn't comment on it. He gave them food. He gave them work. He put Victor to work clearing the rubble. He put Cole to work helping Malik repair the roof. He asked them to turn in the knife and the sawed-off shotgun to the communal storage. Victor handed them over right away. Cole hesitated. Then he turned them in too. By lunchtime, Dan was in control of 5 out of 7 buildings within a 300-meter radius. The 6th building, a collapsed house, turned out to be useless. It was too badly damaged. The 7th, with the old man inside, took care of itself. Ruth went in to see him. She checked him out. The old man was sick. He had a fever and was dehydrated. Ruth gave him water and some powder from the first aid kit. She carried him to the gas station. The old man's name was Oscar, 71 years old, a former mailman. He couldn't work, but Dan put him on the list anyway. Every person is a vote. Every vote is a unit in the system. The system flashed. Condition met. The gas station block is under control. Reward, 50 system fighters. 1 metric ton of additional supplies. Dan was standing in the middle of the gas station when it happened. The air quivered. Not like the wind, like something bigger. People appeared outside the windows on the street. 50 people, all at once, as if they'd been painted against the backdrop of the gray city. All in identical uniforms. Gray-green, no patches, no insignia. Weapons, automatic rifles, knives, walkie-talkies, ammo pouches. They stood in 2 rows facing the gas station. Silent, motionless, waiting. Malik dropped his hammer. Curtis grabbed the kids and dragged them to the wall. Knox reached for his belt where his knife used to be. Patty pressed her hand to her mouth. Everyone was looking at Dan. Dan was looking at 50 fighters. 50 trained, armed men waiting for his order. This was more than Willie's gang, more than all of Ashford's small gangs combined. He could work with this. He could already build something with this. He stepped out onto the street. He walked up to the first row. He looked at the fighter closest to him, a man in his 30s, short-cropped hair, calm eyes, neither fear nor eagerness, just readiness. Dan asked, "What's your name?" The fighter replied, "Grant, Sergeant Grant." Dan nodded. "Sergeant Grant, I need the senior-most among these 50. That's you." Grant wasn't surprised. He simply said, "Roger that." Dan turned to the rest of them. He counted them in his head. 50 fighters, 16 civilians, including children and an old man. 1 metric ton of new supplies, plus 9 metric tons and the remainder from the starter kit. Weapons from the basement. A block of 7 buildings. This is no longer just a dot on the map. This is already a base. But a base that would come under attack tomorrow. Because 50 armed men appearing out of nowhere is an event that's impossible to hide. Willie's gang, 2 blocks to the south, would find out by evening. Other gangs would find out tomorrow. And they'd all ask the same question. Where did they come from? And that question would be followed by a second. How do we take them out? Dan went back inside. He sat down on his crate. He looked at the list of names. 23 names if you count the regular fighters by name. He didn't know any of them yet. So that was his first task for today, to learn every name, all 50 of them. He called Leo over. "Grab some paper," he said. We're going to get to know them." Leo looked at him like he was crazy. "They're soldiers. Why do you need their names?" Dan replied, "Because a person whose name you remember will die for you, but a number on a list will run at the first shot. Let's go." By evening, Dan had a complete list, 50 names, 50 specialties. Among the system fighters, there were not only riflemen, 3 sappers, 2 signalmen, 1 medic, 4 mechanics. Dan read through the list 3 times. Then he began drawing a diagram on the back of the sheet. Post assignments, guard shifts, areas of responsibility, who guards the warehouse, who patrols the perimeter, who stands at the observation post on the roof, who is on rest duty. He immediately sent the medic to Ruth. Now they had 2 medics. The mechanics went to Malik. He put the radio operators on their radios and ordered them to monitor the airwaves. Any frequencies, any communications. If anyone in the wasteland is using radio communication, Dan wants to know who and what they're talking about. Night fell over Ashford. Quiet. Relatively quiet. Somewhere far to the south, a light flickered. Maybe a campfire. Maybe something else. The sentries stood at their posts. Knox was making the rounds, checking on the men. He was doing this on his own initiative. Dan noticed and mentally gave him credit for it. Self-organization among subordinates is the most valuable resource, more valuable than flour. Before going to sleep, Dan stood by the broken window and looked out at the street. Gray, empty, dead. But not quite dead yet. A fire was burning at the gas station. Patty was heating water for the morning flatbreads. Curtis was putting the kids to bed. Ruth was checking on old Oscar. Malik had fallen asleep right next to the hammer, still clutching it in his hand. The smell of hot bread still lingered in the air, faint but real. The first in 10 years on this street. Dan closed his eyes. Tomorrow he'd have to deal with Willie. If not tomorrow, then the day after. Because Willie and his 12 men weren't a threat. They were a resource. 12 pairs of hands, 12 mouths to feed, 12 people who could work instead of robbing. He just had to figure it out right and present it right. On the morning of the 3rd of the day, Dan sent a negotiator to see Willie, not Knox. Knox knew Willie personally, and there was a history between them that Knox didn't care to recount, but it was clear from his expression that it was a bad one. Dan sent Frank, an old farmer, harmless-looking, with a gray beard and weathered hands. Frank carried a sack of flour, 5 kilos, and a note written by Leo as Dan dictated. The note contained numbers, 12 people, 4 kilograms of grain per day for everyone on a minimal ration. According to Knox's estimate, Willie's gang had no more than 10 days worth of supplies left. In 10 days, there were 3 options. Raid the gas station and die because there were 50 armed fighters there, start starving and lose people, or go to Dan and get food, work, and a place in the new structure. At the bottom of the note was a signature, Den Cross, Ashford's manager. Manager. Not a leader, not a chief, not a boss. Manager. Dan chose that word deliberately. It sounded neutral, not threatening, almost boring. That's exactly how he wanted it. Frank returned 2 hours later, without the sack of flour. They'd taken the flour. They'd read the note. Willie said he'd think it over. They hadn't touched Frank. They'd even given him water. Dan nodded. "All right," he said. "Now we wait." And he ordered Grant to set up reinforced checkpoints along the southern route, just in case Willie decided that an attack was the best of the 3 options. They had to wait 2 days. Dan didn't waste those 2 days. He worked, from morning till night. He spent the first day in the basement. He counted every crate, every single item. He drew up a complete inventory. The 10 metric tons were distributed as follows. 3 metric tons of flour, 2 metric tons of rice, 1 metric ton of beans, 500 kilograms of powdered milk, 200 kilograms of salt, 200 kilograms of sugar, 300 liters of vegetable oil, medicines in a separate box, seeds in a separate box, plus 1 metric ton from the quarterly bonus. Total, 11 metric tons. With the current population of 16 civilians and 50 soldiers, that's 66 mouths to feed. At a ration of half a kilo of dry goods per person per day, that's 33 kilograms per day. 11 metric tons is 11,000 kilograms. Divide that by 33. 333 days. Almost a year. But that's without population growth. If people keep coming, and they will, the supply will dwindle faster. With 100 people, it'll last 220 days. With 200, 110. With 500, 44 days. The numbers didn't lie. They never do. Food is finite. Production is essential. Not in a month, right now. Dan spent the second day surveying the area. He took Grant and 2 fighters with him and walked the entire northern block of Ashford. 3 streets, dozens of ruined buildings, a former school, brick, 2 stories. The roof had sagged, but the walls were intact. A former church, small, wooden, almost in ruins. A former grocery store, empty, looted long ago. And the building that made Dan's eyes light up, a former bakery, small, on the corner, with a brick oven standing at the back of the room. Massive, a cast iron door. The chimney led through the wall to the outside. The oven was filled with debris, but when Malik cleared it out and Dan inspected the firebox, it turned out to be intact. No cracks in the masonry. The door was in place. The grates were in place. This oven could work, right now, if you fed it wood and flour. Dan stood in front of this oven and felt something he hadn't felt since the days of his old warehouse. Excitement. Pure professional excitement. Not because the oven was beautiful, but because an oven is a transformation. Flour into dough, dough into bread, bread into calories, calories into people who work for the territory into security. The whole chain begins here, in this shabby bakery with a cast iron door. He ordered Malik and 4 systems mechanics to start clearing out the building immediately. By evening, the bakery was clean. The trash had been hauled out, the floor was swept, the windows were boarded up against the wind. The oven was fired up for a test run. There was a draft. It works. Dan asked Patty to bake the first test loaf. Real bread, not a flat bread over a campfire, but bread from an oven. Patty looked at him with wide eyes. She said she hadn't baked bread in 15 years. Dan said it was like riding a bike. You never forget. Patty wasn't sure, but she went along. By the morning of the 5th day, the bakery smelled of bread. Real bread. Hot, with a crust. The scent drifted out onto the street and flowed through the neighborhood like a living thing. The people at the gas station froze. Curtis's children looked up. Little Sam started to cry. Not out of fear, because of the smell. He didn't know what the smell was. He was born after the gray year and had never tasted bread. Patty carried out the loaf. Hot, heavy, a little lopsided, with a crack on the side. Not perfect, but real. She held it with both hands, and her lips were trembling. Dan took a knife. He sliced the bread. He handed out a slice to each person, calling each one by name. Malik, Frank, Ruth, Tyrone, Patty, Curtis, Rachel, Leo, Knox, Victor, Cole. Everyone got their slice and their name. The children got bigger slices. The old man Oscar got his slice soaked in warm water because he had almost no teeth left. Dan ate last. The bread was coarse, a little bland, with a slight bitterness from old yeast. It was the best bread he'd ever tasted in both his lives. Willie arrived on the 6th day, not alone, with all 12 of them. They arrived in the morning, unarmed. Or rather, they did have weapons, axes, pipes, and 1 homemade crossbow. But they carried them openly, making no attempt to hide them, not for fighting, but to deliver a message. Willie was a big man, broad-shouldered, shaved head, a scar running across his entire left cheek, hands like shovels. He walked onto the gas station grounds and stopped 10 paces away from Dan. He looked at Grant's men standing along the perimeter. He looked at the gas station, at the smoke rising from the bakery's chimney, at Curtis's kids playing by the wall, at the smell of bread. Then he looked at Dan. He said, "You're the guy with the note." Dan nodded. Willie said, "You counted our supplies more accurately than I did myself." Dan said, "That's my job, to count." Willie stood in silence. He watched. His men stood behind him, hungry, on edge. One of them, a guy about 18, looked at the bakery and swallowed hard. Willie said, "What kind of job is this?" Dan replied, "He needs loaders for the warehouse, construction workers to restore the buildings, security for the northern perimeter. Willie will be the foreman of the loaders. His men will get a full ration, bread, grains, water, shelter, a medical exam. In exchange, they'd work 6 days a week, the 7th day off. Weapons must be turned in to the communal armory. Anyone who steals is out. Anyone who raises a hand against a civilian is out. No exceptions." Willie listened without interrupting. Then he asked one question. "What if I refuse?" Dan replied calmly. "Then in 10 days, he'll pick up his men on the street, the hungry ones, one by one, and they'll come on their own." without a foreman, and Willie would be left alone with an empty axe. This isn't a threat. It's simple math. Willie stared at him for a long time. Then he turned to his men. He said briefly, "We're handing over the metal," and he was the first to lay his axe on the ground. By the evening of the 6th day, Dan had 78 men, 50 system fighters, 28 civilians, including 12 of Willie's former gang members, 3 buildings in active use, the office serving as headquarters, a bakery, and a former school that Curtis had begun renovating into a residential block. The system flashed a new condition: expand control to the borders of northern Ashford, take control of at least 5 buildings, establish a stable supply chain. Reward: 50 more system fighters, an expanded supply of medical supplies, 1 specialist engineer. Dan read the condition. A specialist engineer. That was interesting. Very interesting. An engineer could solve the problem that had been keeping him awake: water. The well at the gas station produced murky water with a rusty aftertaste. It was drinkable, but if people drank that water for long enough, they'd start getting sick. They needed filtration. They needed purification. They needed someone who knew how to do it. Dan closed the system window. He looked at the list of tasks that Leo kept in his notebook. The list grew every day. Restore the school, set up a guard duty roster, organize laundry, find a source of firewood for the stove, repair the road to the northern exit, inspect the water tower on the outskirts. Each item meant a day's work, or 2, or 5. We're short on people. We have enough food for now. But "for now" is the key phrase. Before going to sleep, Dan went up to the roof of the gas station. He stood alone. He looked south. Somewhere out there beyond the horizon, the Crow's Brood Syndicate was on the move. Gasoline, armored pickup trucks, radio communications, hundreds of fighters, a machine designed to crush small settlements. 3 or 4 months, according to rumors. Maybe less. Dan had 50 fighters, a bag of flour, an oven, and a manager's notebook. The numbers aren't in his favor, yet. But the numbers change, every day, with every decision, with every name on the list. On the 8th day, a woman arrived in Ashford with children. Not alone, with a group. 11 people, 4 adults, 7 children between the ages of 3 and 12. Dirty, hungry, barely able to stand. They were coming from the east. 2 days without water. One child was in the woman's arms and wasn't moving. The sentry at the eastern post called Grant. Grant called Dan. Dan went out to meet them. He looked. The woman in front was tall, skin and bones, with weary eyes behind cracked glasses. Her hair was tied back in a dirty bun. She was holding a girl of about 5 in her arms and looked at Dan without fear, without pleading, with that calm stubbornness of people who had long since stopped being afraid because there was nothing left to fear. All the bad things had already happened. She said her name was Evelyn Bright, that she was a teacher, that these children were hers, not by blood, by survival. She'd been gathering them for 8 years, in basements, in the ruins, in the gutters. She fed them whatever she could, taught them to read from scraps of books, hid them from the gangs. 2 days ago, looters found their hideout in the church basement. They had to flee. They'd heard a rumor that in Ashford they'd be fed and not beaten. They came to check it out. Dan looked at her, then at the children, then at the little girl in her arms who wasn't moving. He asked quietly, "The girl?" Evelyn said, "Dehydration, 2 days without water. She needs a doctor." Dan turned to Grant. "Ruth, come here, right now. Water, food, blankets, now." 10 minutes later, Ruth and a medic from the system fighters were tending to the girl. Saline solution, water, drop by drop, a damp cloth on her forehead. The other children were being fed, slowly, little by little. Too much food after starvation is dangerous. Dan knew this not from medicine, but from logistics. Restoring damaged cargo requires a careful, step-by-step procedure. People aren't cargo, but the principle is the same. Evelyn sat next to the girl and didn't let go of her hand. Dan approached. He sat down beside her. He was silent for a moment. Then he spoke. He had a building, a former school. Curtis was restoring it. The walls were intact. The roof would be repaired in a week. If Evelyn agrees, he wants her to teach again. Not in the basement, at the school, with desks, with blackboards, with everything he can find. Evelyn looked at him for a long time. Then she said quietly, "She used to have 120 students, before the gray. First grade. They were 6 years old. She doesn't know how many of them are still alive." Dan said, "There'll be new ones here, as many as come." Evelyn didn't answer, but she didn't refuse either. The girl survived. By evening, she opened her eyes and asked for a drink. Ruth smiled. For the first time in all the time Dan had known her. On the 9th day, Dan set about finding water. It was a problem that couldn't be put off. The well at the gas station provided water, but it was murky. It had an aftertaste. There was something in it that would cause intestinal infections a month from now. Ruth had already warned them. Dan asked Knox and 2 fighters to survey the northern outskirts. According to Old Man Oscar, there was a water tower there. Old, rusty, but if the pipes were intact, there should be an artesian well beneath it. Knox returned with news. The tower is still standing. Rusty, as expected, but it's still standing. The pump is broken. The pipes are buried. Their condition is unknown. And one more detail. Someone lives near the tower. Not a gang, just one girl. Small, wearing glasses, with hands smeared with oil. She was fiddling with the pump mechanism when Knox spotted her. She saw him and scurried away like a mouse. Dan went to the tower alone. He took Malik with him. No fighters. Fighters would scare her. Malik is young and doesn't look intimidating. They found the girl in a tool shed at the foot of the tower. She was sitting at a workbench cluttered with parts, gears, wires, a disassembled motor. The tools were laid out in perfect order, each in its place. That was the first thing Dan noticed. Order. In a world where everything had fallen apart, that workbench was like an island of common sense. The girl looked at them from behind her glasses, terrified, but she didn't run away. She stood by her workbench as if it were her last line of defense. Dan said, "What's your name? How old are you? What can you do?" The same 3 questions, for everyone, no exceptions. The girl's name was Ji-yeon Park, 24 years old, Korean, a former engineering student. She was a sophomore when the gray year happened. For the 8 years since then, she'd been fixing everything that could be fixed. Tractors, pumps, generators, locks, gates, water pipes, anything. People would come by. They'd bring her broken things. She'd fix them. They'd give her food. Sometimes they would. Sometimes they'd just take the repaired item and leave. Sometimes they'd say, "Thanks, girl." They never asked her name. Dan looked at the workbench. He looked at the disassembled pump. He asked, "You can fix this pump." Ji-yeon said, "Maybe, if we have a bearing of the right size, and a seal, and someone to help lift the head. It's heavy." Dan said, "Malik will help lift it. We'll find a bearing and a seal. If you fix this pump, you'll get a job." Ashford's chief engineer, the workshop, assistants, a meal allowance, and no one will take your work without paying you anymore. Ji-yeon stared at him, then at Malik, then back at Dan. She said quietly, "Chief engineer. That's a real job." Dan almost smiled. It was the second time he'd heard that phrase. Knox had said the same thing about the head of security. People in the wasteland had forgotten that work could be something more than just survival, that it could have a name, and that name meant something. He said, "A real one, with a piece of paper and a signature, when we get to the paper." Ji-yeon nodded and turned back to the pump. A minute later, she was already talking to Malik in the language of gears and diameters, explaining to him that the thread on the fitting was left-handed, not right-handed. By the 11th day, 3 things had happened. First, the pump started working. Ji-yeon fixed it in 2 days. Malik and Tyrone helped carry the heavy parts. They found the bearing at an abandoned auto repair shop 3 blocks away. Ji-yeon cut the oil seal out of an old tire. When the pump sent water up to the tower and it began flowing from the faucet, rusty but clean, Dan stood nearby and took measurements. Liters per minute, pressure, and the tank capacity. With a full tank, the tower supplies water for 200 people. With the filtration system Ji-yeon promised to set up in a week, it'll be enough for 400. Second, the system counted the water tower as a captured objective, reward, an expanded medical kit, antibiotics, surgical instruments, anesthetics, dressing supplies. Ruth took the box, her hands trembling. She opened it and saw a scalpel, a real one, made of surgical steel. She held it and couldn't speak. For 8 years, she'd been cutting with a can opener. 8 years. Third, Sarah Lynn arrived. Or rather, she wasn't brought here on her own. 2 refugees from the south brought her in, a man and a woman. They found her on the road, alone, with a backpack full of medical supplies. She was heading north because she'd heard a rumor. In Ashford, there's someone who's building, who's feeding people, who's treating the sick. She decided to check it out. If it was a lie, she'd keep going. If it was true, she'd stay. Sarah was short. Her hair was cut short. Her face was calm, reserved. Her eyes were like those of someone who had seen too much and stopped reacting. Korean American. In her backpack, she had a field first aid kit, put together by hand, herbs, tinctures, homemade bandages, homemade splints. She was a doctor, self-taught. 2 semesters of medical school before the gray year, and 8 years of field experience. She knew how to stitch wounds, set broken bones, deliver babies, identify infections by smell. She'd lost count of the patients she'd buried. Dan met her at the entrance to the gas station. He handed her a cracker and some water. He asked 3 questions. Sarah answered briefly, without unnecessary words, without emotion, just like in a report. Dan said, he had a building, on the south side of the block, a brick building, sturdy. He wants to turn it into a field hospital, a real one, with an operating room, with beds, with water and electricity, and he needs a doctor. Sarah looked at him intently. She said, "You can't build a field hospital on a whim. We need an autoclave. You need lighting. You need clean water. You need instruments. Without that, a field hospital is just a room where people die on cots instead of on the ground." Dan pulled a list out of his pocket. He showed it to her. Autoclave, check, from the standard medical kit. Lighting. Ji-yeon will put something together using a car battery and a solar panel. Clean water. Bash is working on it. Filtration in a week. Tools. We already have a scalpel. The rest will come. Sarah read the list. Then she looked at Dan, then back at the list. Then she said quietly, "Who are you?" Dan replied, "A manager. My job is supply chains." Sarah didn't smile, but something in her expression shifted by 0.5 millimeter. She said, "All right, show me the building." By the evening of the 11th day, Dan had 94 people, a doctor, an engineer, a teacher, a bakery, a water tower, a future infirmary, a future school, and the systemic requirement for control over all of northern Ashford, which was 70% complete. 2 buildings remained, along with a stable supply chain. Supply is a matter of logistics, and logistics is what Dan lives for. He sat on the roof gas station and looked at the lights. There were more of them now. A light was on in the bakery. Ji-yeon had plugged a lamp into the battery. A warm yellow light in the window. The first electric light in this town in 10 years. Down in the courtyard was Hana Cho, 19 years old, Korean, the daughter of a former restaurant owner. She arrived on the 9th day, quiet, reserved, with pots in her hands. She didn't ask for food. She asked to be given the kitchen. She said she knew how to cook. Dan her the kitchen and some ingredients. That evening, the whole team ate soup. Not from packets, real soup, made from beans, flour, and dried herbs that Hana found in the cracks in the asphalt. Tyrone ate 3 bowls and looked at Hana as if she were a goddess. Even Knox asked for seconds, silently, but he asked. Hana stood by the fire down below, stirring something in the pot. She was cooking for the morning, small, quiet, with hands that never stopped for a second. Dan remembered her story. Her father was killed over a sack of rice, right before her eyes. She was 14. She'd survived on her own for 5 years. She fed the others when she could. She fed herself last. Dan looked at the fires, at the people, at this little patch of warmth in the middle of a gray, dead city, and he thought, 3 months, maybe less. The syndicate is coming. They have gas, pickup trucks, radios, and hundreds of people. And he has 94 people, a furnace, a pump, and a notebook. The math still isn't in his favor, but it's changing. Every day, just a little bit, and those little bits add up. He knew that for sure, from his past life, from 1,000 quarterly reports. Small numbers beat big numbers if the small numbers grow every day. On the 14th day, Dan secured northern Ashford. Grant's fighters took the last 2 buildings on the outskirts without a fight. One stood empty. The second was home to 3 vagrants who, at the sight of an armed patrol, came out on their own and asked to be taken to Ashford. They were given food and work, clearing debris from the main street. Not the most pleasant job, but it came with rations and a roof over their heads. The system flashed. Condition met. Control over northern Ashford established. Reward? 50 system soldiers, medical supplies, 1 engineering specialist. 50 new fighters appeared, just like the first ones had. Out of thin air, out of nowhere. They lined up in formation and waited. Dan wasn't surprised anymore. The others were. Willie looked at them and scratched the back of his shaved head. Curtis took the kids away, just in case. Knox stood calmly. He'd seen this once before and had decided not to dwell on it. They were fighters, and that was good enough. Where they came from wasn't his problem. The engineer appeared separately, not in formation. He came around the corner of the building and approached Dan as if they'd arranged to meet. A man in his 40s, graying, calm, with calloused hands. He introduced himself as Henrik, a military engineer, specializing in fortifications and water supply. Dan looked at him and silently thanked the system for the first time. Henrik was exactly what they needed. Fortifications meant he could design a defensive perimeter. Water supply meant he could help Ji-yun with filtration. 2 in 1. Dan led Henrik over to Ji-yun. He introduced them. He said,
Henrik is in charge of defense and water. Ji-yun is in charge of everything else related to mechanics.
Work it out between yourselves who does what. Report your plan to me in an hour.
Ji-yun looked at Henrik. Henrik looked at Ji-yun, then at her workbench, then at the tools laid out on it. He asked,
Did you fix that pump?
Ji-yun nodded. Henrik said,
Not bad. Left-hand thread on the fitting.
Ji-yun looked at him a little more intently. She said, You're the first one to notice. An hour later, they brought Dan not 1 plan, but 3. The first, water filtration, a sand filter, gravel, charcoal, a pipe with a sediment trap.
We have the materials. It'll take 2 days.
Second, perimeter, a wall of concrete blocks around the central block, 2 meters high, gates at the 3 entrances, watchtowers at the corners. It'll take a week and 40 people.
Third, electricity.
Ji-yun suggested building a wind turbine out of a car alternator and blades cut from sheet metal.
It would generate enough power to light the headquarters and the infirmary. It would take 3 days. Dan read all 3 proposals. He approved all 3. He set the priorities: water first, the wall second, and electricity third. He asked Ji-yun if she could help Sarah with the infirmary equipment at the same time. Ji-yun said she could if she were given 1 more assistant. Dan assigned her 2 of the system's mechanics. On the 15th day, the infirmary opened. Not at full capacity, but it opened. A brick building on the south side of the block. 6 beds. An operating table made from a door propped up on trestles. A wood-fired autoclave. Lighting from a battery. Water from the tower through a hose that Malik had stretched halfway across the block. Not ideal. Far from ideal. But Sarah stood in the middle of the room and looked at the scalpel in her hand, at the light from the lamp, and at the clean water flowing from the faucet. And for the first time in 8 years, she thought that maybe she wouldn't just have to certify a death. The first patient arrived that same day, an 11-year-old boy from Evelyn's group, an infected wound on his leg. It had been festering for 10 days. Without antibiotics, he would have lost his leg, or his life. Sarah cleaned the wound. She inserted a drain. She administered antibiotics. By morning, the inflammation had begun to subside. The boy was asleep. Sarah sat beside him, wide awake. She monitored his temperature. When Dan came in the morning, she said, without turning around, "He'll survive." Dan replied, "I know." "You're a good doctor," Sarah said. "I'm not a good doctor. I'm a doctor who, for the first time in 8 years, has the means to treat patients." Dan remained silent, because there was no right answer. There was only the next step. Even more medicine, even better equipment, even cleaner water. The supply chain from the warehouse to the patient. His language, his work. On the 16th day, Dan convened his first meeting, not because he wanted to feel like a ruler, but because the tasks had become too big for one person to handle alone. They gathered at the gas station, around a long table made of planks. Dan, Grant, Knox, Sarah, Ji-yun, Henrik, Evelyn, Hannah, Willie, Leo taking notes. 10 people. Dan looked at them and thought that 2 weeks ago he had been alone on the cold concrete. Then he pushed the thought aside. Nostalgia is a luxury. There's an agenda. The agenda was as follows. Item 1, population. 144 people, including 100 system fighters, growing every day. Word is spreading. People are coming. We need to prepare housing. Item 2, food. Supplies will last 210 days at the current rate of consumption. If population growth continues, that time frame will be cut in half within 2 months. We need production, not tomorrow, yesterday. Item 3, security. North Ashford is under control. South and West Ashford are not. In the south, remnants of small gangs remain. In the west, the situation is unknown. In the far south, the syndicate. Item 4, infrastructure. The school is almost ready. The infirmary is operational. The bakery is operational. The water filter will be up and running in a day. The wall in a week. We need a mill. We need a laundry. We need a grain warehouse. Item 5. People. Morale is good, but fragile. One serious blow and panic will destroy everything. Grant spoke briefly. We need to scout the southern sector. Send out patrols. Set up observation posts. If the syndicate is coming, we need to know in advance. Not a day, but at least a week. Knox said he has information. He spoke with vagrants who passed through Ashford 2 days ago. They were coming from the south. They said the syndicate had taken the town of Laramie. That's 60 kilometers away. They hanged 4 people on a road sign. Took the rest. Grain, women, teenagers. Silence at the table. Long. Heavy. Evelyn clenched her hands under the table. Hannah stirring her tea. Even Willie sat up straight and looked serious. Dan didn't comment. He just said, 60 kilometers. At the syndicate's current pace, that's 2 or 3 months. Maybe less if they speed up. So we have 2 months to become impregnable, or at least too expensive for them to bother with us. Sarah asked, how are you going to do that? With a wall and 100 fighters? Dan replied, a wall and 100 fighters and a mill and an infirmary and a school and a road and 10 settlements that will trade with us instead of the syndicate. Strength isn't just about weapons. Strength is what people want to protect. No one answered, but no one objected either. After the council meeting, Dan pulled Hannah aside. He told her he needed someone to keep track of the food, not to cook it, to keep track. How much came in, how much went out, how much was left, how much each person was entitled to. According to the standards, according to rank, according to age. Children get more than adults. The sick get more than the healthy. Workers get more than those who aren't working. But no one gets 0. That's the rule. Absolute. Even those who can't work receive a minimum ration, because a person who doesn't eat dies, and a dead person is a failure of the system. Hannah listened in silence. Then she asked, why her? She's just a cook. Dan said, because she knows the value of food, not in money, in lives. She's seen people killed over a sack of rice. She won't let anyone steal even a handful, and she won't let anyone go hungry, because to her, it's one and the same. Hannah was silent, then she nodded, quietly, without a word, and she went back to her pots. On the 18th day, the wall was half finished. Concrete blocks from demolished buildings. Willie and his men hauled them by hand. Hard work, dirty work. But Willie didn't complain. He worked silently and grimly, and his men worked the same way. The former gangsters turned out to be the best porters in Ashford. They were used to hauling heavy loads. Only before, they'd been hauling other people's stuff. Now, they were hauling their own. On the 20th day, what Dan had been waiting for, and fearing, happened. Syndicate scouts. Mika was the first to spot them. Malika Okafor, 22 years old, black, lean, quick, with a scar across her eyebrow. A former courier and scout for a small gang that had fallen apart a month ago. She arrived in Ashford on the 12th day, alone, with a knife and a walkie-talkie. She asked for a job. Dan looked at her, at the knife, at the walkie-talkie, at the scar. He asked 3 questions. He listened, and he appointed her head of intelligence and communications. Mika couldn't believe it. She said, head of what? Dan repeated, intelligence and communications. Her job was to know what was happening around Ashford. Who was coming, where from, how many, and why. She was given a walkie-talkie, a map, 3 fighters under her command, and the right to report directly to Dan, bypassing everyone else. Mika said no one had ever given her that authority before. Dan said, now you have it. On the 20th day, Mika fully justified her assignment. She spotted them on the southern outskirts, 2 of them, on motorcycles, with binoculars. They were riding slowly, stopping, looking around. One was jotting something down in a notebook. Classic reconnaissance. Mika didn't approach them. She memorized the direction, the license plate numbers on the motorcycles, their clothing, their weapons. She returned and reported to Dan. Dan listened. Then he asked, had they seen the wall? Mika said they had. They stood there and looked at it for about 3 minutes. Then they rode off to the south. Dan nodded. So in a week or 2, the syndicate would know everything. Ashford's size, the number of people, the wall, the fighters, maybe even the bakery and the infirmary. Information was their commodity. They'd gather it and pass it up the chain, to Garrett Wayne. Dan called Grant. He said, double the patrols along the southern flank. Set up an observation post on the roof of the tallest building to the south, round the clock. If the syndicate scouts return, don't touch them. Let them watch. Let them count. Let them see the wall, the fighters, and the smoke from the oven. Let them report to Wayne that Ashford is not an easy target. Grant asked, "What if it's not reconnaissance? What if it's the vanguard?" Dan replied, "A vanguard doesn't ride on 2 motorcycles with binoculars. A vanguard arrives in armored pickup trucks. But just in case, put the 3rd platoon on standby." On the evening of the 20th, Dan sat at the gas station poring over a map. Leo had drawn the map freehand, based on descriptions from Knox and Mickey. It was imprecise, rough, but better than nothing. Ashford was marked on it. The northern part was shaded in, under control. The southern and western parts were blank. Beyond them were dots, villages, towns, ruins, the living and the dead. And far to the south, a bold dot, Crow's Ford. Garrett Wayne, gas, pickup trucks, radio, hundreds of people. Dan looked at the map and thought, 100 fighters is a lot for Ashford, but not enough for a war against the Syndicate. He needed more territory, more people, more resources. The system only grants them for conquests, so he needs to expand, not conquer. That word didn't suit him. Grow. Like a network of warehouses, one node connects to another. Each node is a settlement. Each settlement is people and resources and a buffer between him and the Syndicate. He picked up a pencil and drew a line, from Ashford westward, to a spot Knox called Creek Hollow, a small settlement, 10 to 15 people. There's a well, there's an old grain elevator. If he fixed it up, it would be a grain storage facility, and a grain storage facility is the foundation of the food supply chain. Flour from a warehouse runs out eventually. Grain from the field is endless. If there's a field, seeds, and hands to work it. He had the seeds from the starter kit. Dan opened Leo's notebook and found the entry. Seeds, wheat, corn, beans, sunflowers, 50 kilos of each, 200 kilos of seeds. If planted correctly, that's a harvest enough to feed hundreds of people. But to plant them, you need land. And the land in the wasteland is caked and dead. It needs to be plowed. It needs water for irrigation. It needs time. At least 3 months until the first harvest. 3 months. Just as long as it takes for the Syndicate to arrive. A race. Who will make it first? The Syndicate will arrive and crush everything. Or Dan will grow his crops and hold his ground. He closed the notebook. He looked at the map. Tomorrow he'll send Mika to Creek Hollow on a reconnaissance mission to find out who lives there, what they want, what they fear, whether a deal is possible. If so, the terms would be simple. Food and protection in exchange for grain and the grain elevator. A fair exchange. Both sides get what they lack. That was his strategy. Not a sword, not a shield. Barter. A supply chain. Every settlement is a link. Every link is stronger when it's part of the chain. The Syndicate takes by force. Dan takes by logistics. And logistics defeats force because force breaks, but a supply chain bends. He went to bed, or tried to. His body ached. Still thin, still weak. He ate like everyone else, the standard ration, no more. Hana tried to slip him an extra piece every time. He pushed it away every time, not because he didn't want to, because if the manager eats more than the norms don't work. It's a rule with no exceptions, not even for him. Night outside the wall. Quiet. Guards at their posts. 100 fighters are enough to secure the perimeter and sleep peacefully. Almost peacefully. Somewhere in the south, the Syndicate is on the move. Somewhere in the system, a new condition is flashing that Dan hasn't unlocked yet. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a story that will demand more from him than a notebook and a list. But that's tomorrow. Today, he closes his eyes and counts. 144 people, 11 metric tons minus consumption over 20 days, 1 bakery, 1 infirmary, 1 school almost finished, 1 wall half built, 1 engineer, and 1 female engineer who, in 3 days, accomplished more than the entire town had in 10 years. 1 cook who feeds 144 mouths and has never once been off by a single gram. 1 former gangster who became the best foreman. 1 former farmer who lays bricks as naturally as he breathes. 1 teacher who will open the school tomorrow. 1 doctor who saved a boy today. 1 scout who spotted the Syndicate before it spotted her. Numbers, names, tasks. This is his world, the only one he understands, and the only one in which he can win. Mika returned from Creek Hollow on the 22nd day. She didn't come alone. An old man was with her, gaunt, tanned by the sun, with hands that looked like tree roots. His name was Burke. He was the town elder of Creek Hollow, if you could call a man who just happened to be the oldest of those remaining an elder. 13 people, 3 families, 1 well, 1 dilapidated grain elevator, and a vegetable garden with 6 beds growing something resembled potatoes. Mika said that Burke had agreed to talk. Nothing more, just talk. Dan met him at the gas station, sat him down at a table. Hannah brought soup and bread. Burke stared at the bread for a long time. Then he picked it up, took a bite. He chewed slowly, and Dan could see in his eyes that this bread would settle the negotiations better than any words. Dan didn't press him. He didn't rush him. He let Burke eat. Then he began to speak, calmly, as if at a meeting with a supplier. He laid out the proposal. Ashford would take Creek Hollow under its protection, a patrol of 10 fighters, permanent, plus rations for all 13 people, plus a medical exam from Sarah, plus repairs to the grain elevator by Gian and Molly. In exchange, Creek Hollow would allocate land for crops, 50 hectares. The grain elevator operates for the common fund. The harvest is split 70 to 30, 70 for Creek Hollow, 30 for Ashford. Burke runs his settlement as before. No one meddles, no one gives orders, just a partnership. Burke listened. Then he asked a question. What if I refuse? Dan said, then I'll shake Burke's hand and Mick will walk him back. No consequences, no threats, just 2 settlements, side by side. Everyone's on their own, but in 2 months, the syndicate will come from the south, and Creek Hollow, with its 13 people and 1 well, will be the first thing they see. Dan isn't threatening, he's informing. Burke was silent for a minute. Then he said, 70 to 30. Dan nodded. 70 for you. Burke said, I thought it would be the other way around. Dan replied, the other way around would be robbery. He's not a robber, he's a manager. He needs a supply chain that works for years, and the chain only works when both sides are satisfied. Burke finished his bread. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. All right, he said, but if you cheat, I'll personally kill you. I'm 72. I've got nothing to lose. Dan said, agreed. Leo, write down the terms. Leo wrote them down. This was Ashford's second official document. The first was Ji-Yun's appointment as chief engineer. The second was the partnership agreement with Creek Hollow. Burke put a cross in place of a signature. Dan signed his full name, Daniel Cross, Ashford's manager. On the 23rd day, Dan sent the following to Creek Hollow. 10 fighters under the command of Corporal Ito, plus Malik and one of the systems mechanics. Task number 1, the elevator. Inspect it, assess it, draw up a repair plan. Task number 2, the land. Find areas suitable for plowing. Task number 3, security. Establish a perimeter, observation post, radio contact with Ashford. Malik returned 2 days later with a report. The grain elevator is old but sturdy. Concrete walls, metal roof, capacity of about 200 metric tons of grain. The feed mechanism is broken, but Ji-Yun said she could fix it in a week if they provided the spare parts. The soil is worse, caked solid. A crust as thick as a finger. Nothing to plow with. No tractors, no horses. Just our hands. But Frank looked at the ground, felt it, sniffed it, said that beneath the crust the soil was alive. If we break up the crust and water it, it will yield a harvest. Not right away, but it will yield a harvest. Dan did the math. 50 hectares is 500,000 square meters. Breaking up the crust by hand over that area would take thousands of man-hours. He didn't have that many hands, so he'd have to start small. 5 hectares, then 10, then 20. Each hectare of wheat yields 2 to 3 metric tons of grain in a good harvest. 5 hectares is 10 to 15 metric tons. That's enough to feed hundreds of people for a year. If there's a harvest, if it rains, if the soil doesn't let us down. A lot of ifs. But without crops, there are no options at all. On the 25th day, Dan made a decision his team didn't understand. He sent 30 people out to plow. 30 out of 144. 20 system fighters and 10 civilians, including Willie and his men. With shovels, with pickaxes, with hose that Ji-Yun had welded from rebar and steel strips. 30 men for 5 hectares, for 3 weeks. Grant objected. He said it was dangerous to pull 20 fighters from their positions. The southern flank would be left exposed. Dan replied, in 3 months, the syndicate will be here. If Ashford doesn't have his own grain by then, food will run out in 4 months. And then it won't matter how many fighters are at the positions, because hungry fighters don't fight. Defense doesn't start at the wall. Defense starts in the fields. Grant didn't agree, but he obeyed. He was a soldier. An order is an order. Willie unexpectedly backed Dan up. He said that his men were used to hard work and that tilling the land was more honorable than raiding caravans. Then he added quietly, "And you want to eat regularly, without interruptions." On the 27th day, Rebecca Holt arrived in Ashford. She came from the west, alone, on foot, in a worn camouflage jacket. Tall, short haircut, a scar on her cheekbone. Back straight, steady stride, a military stride. Even in her worn-out boots and with a dusty face, she looked like an officer. Because she was an officer. The sentry at the western checkpoint stopped her. She gave her name and rank. Former National Guard Major, Rebecca Holt. The sentry called Grant. Grant came over. He looked at her, saluted, automatically, as if his body had remembered before his mind did. Then he looked embarrassed. But Beck didn't pay it. Or she pretended not to. Dan met her at the gas station. 3 questions. Beck answered briefly and precisely. Name, rank, specialty. Commanding an infantry unit. Perimeter defense. Tactical planning. She'd been wandering the wasteland for 8 years after her unit was disbanded in the first month of the gray year. The order was to hold the line. Then the order was to retreat. Then there were no more orders. Communications were lost. Command vanished. She gathered whoever she could. 12 people. They held out for 2 years. Then reality caught up with them. Some left, some died. Some simply sat down one day and never got back up. Beck was left alone. Alone for 8 years, with a rifle she never put down, without people to protect. Dan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he didn't offer her a position. Instead, he said, "I have 100 fighters, trained, armed, but they don't have a commander with real combat experience. Grant is good, but Grant is a sergeant. He needs an officer, not a subordinate, but a partner. Someone who can see the entire battlefield, not just their own sector." Beck looked at him for a long time. She said, "You don't look like a soldier." Dan replied, "He's not a soldier. He's a manager. But a manager and an officer have the same goal, to make sure people do the right things in the right order and don't die because of stupidity." Beck was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Show me the positions." Dan showed her. He walked the entire perimeter with her, the wall, the posts, the watchtowers, the observation points. Beck walked in silence, looking around, mentally tallying what her own calculations. She stopped at the southern post. She looked toward the horizon. Then she turned to Dan and said, "The southern flank is exposed. The wall is too thin in the western section. The watchtowers are positioned incorrectly. There are blind spots of 30 degrees on each side. The guard shifts are too long. Attention wanes after 8 hours. We need 4 6-hour shifts, not 3 8-hour ones." Dan wrote it all down. Then he said, "When will you start?" Beck looked at him. She narrowed her eyes slightly. She said, "Tomorrow at dawn." Starting at dawn on the 28th, Beck Holt reorganized Ashford's entire defense in 3 days. She relocated the guard posts. She reinforced the western section of the wall. She repositioned the watchtowers to cover blind spots. She implemented 6-hour shifts. She organized target practice for civilian volunteers. 7 people volunteered. Among them were Victor and Cole, former loners, now militiamen. Beck pushed them like recruits, hard, no exceptions, but fairly. After every session, she told each one what they'd done right and what they'd done wrong, by name. She'd memorized all their names from day one. Dan noticed this and mentally gave her another plus. On the 30th day, the system flashed. A new objective: subdue southern Ashford, clear the area of unorganized groups, establish stable control. The reward? 100 system fighters, armored transport, 2 units, long-range communications equipment. Dan read the objective 3 times. 100 fighters. That's doubling the army. Armored transport. That means mobility. Long-range communications. That means the ability to hear what's happening beyond the wasteland. Maybe even pick up federal frequencies, if they're still working. This changed the scale, from a district to a region. But South Ashford is a problem. Mika reported it. There are at least 2 gangs there. One is small, about 8 people. They're holed up in a former supermarket, living off looting passersby. The second one is more serious, about 20 people. Their leader goes by the nickname Redneck. They've taken over a former gas station and motel. They have firearms, 2 or 3 guns. And they're not starving. They have their own food source. Mika hasn't figured out what it is, but they aren't skinny, so they have something the others don't, Dan thought. With a small gang, it's simple. Same method as with Willie. A note, arithmetic, an offer they can't refuse because the alternative is worse. With Redneck, it's more complicated. 20 people with firearms who aren't starving won't take a note seriously. They're doing just fine as it is. Why change? So first, we need to figure out what they have, where the food comes from, what the source is. Dan called Mika. He said, "Reconnaissance, in depth, 2 days. Find out where Redneck is feeding his people." Mika left at dawn on the 31st. She returned in the evening of the 32nd with information that made Dan clench his fists. Redneck was holding people captive, not his own fighters, others, in the motel basement. 25 people, maybe 30, women, children, old people. He was feeding them barely enough to survive and forcing them to work, on the farm behind the motel. A small plot of land, vegetable beds, chickens, even a pig. The captives tended to it all. Slaves, essentially. Redneck and his men ate the meat, eggs, and vegetables. The captives ate the scraps. Those who didn't work were beaten. Those who tried to escape were hanged on a pole by the motel as a warning to the rest. Mika saw the pole, with the rope. Dan sat and listened, silently. His expression didn't change, but his hands on the table clenched into fists and didn't unclench until the end of the conversation. The council met at night, at the gas station, by the light of a battery-powered lamp. Dan, Grant, Beck, Knox, Mika, Sarah, Henrik, Willie, Leo taking notes. Dan laid out the situation. 20 redneck fighters, 2 or 3 guns, 30 captives. A farm, a motel. The question, how to take them. Beck spoke first. A raid, at night, in 2 groups. The first blocks the motel. The second takes the basement with the hostages. Simultaneously, 10 minutes total. With a 5-to-1 numerical advantage, casualties will be minimal. Grant agreed with the plan. He added that a third group was needed, in case anyone from Redneck's gang tries to escape through the back door. Cut off their escape routes. Knox said he knows this motel. He was there 2 years ago. The back door opens onto a vacant lot. Beyond the vacant lot is a ravine. If anyone runs, they'll head for the ravine. We need to station people there. Dan listened. Then he asked a question. Could we do this without a raid? Could we do it the same way we did with Willie? A note, some math, an offer. Beck looked at him. She said, no. Willie was hungry. Redneck is full. The hungry accept offers. The well-fed don't, especially when they're well-fed at someone else's expense. Willie nodded. He said quietly, she's right. Redneck is the kind of guy who only listens when he's on his knees. Dan was silent for a moment. Then he said, all right, a raid. But there's a rule. Don't touch the prisoners. Not a single one. Women and children are the top priority. Bandage Redneck's wounded fighters and take them to Sarah. Kill only if there's a direct threat to life. Anyone who surrenders, we take, Beck said. And Redneck? Dan replied. We're taking Redneck alive. Beck raised an eyebrow. She asked why. Dan said, because a dead Redneck is a martyr. His men will scatter and seek revenge. A living Redneck on his knees before his former slaves? That's the end of it. The final end. After that, none of his men will want to continue. Silence. Beck looked at Dan. Then she nodded slowly. She said, you're not thinking like a commander. You're thinking like a politician. That's a compliment. Dan said, it's logistics. A dead leader creates chaos. Chaos costs resources. He has few resources, so there must be no chaos. The operation began at dawn on the 34th day. Beck commanded in person. 3 groups, 25 fighters in the first, 20 in the second, 10 in the third at the ravine. Dan stayed at headquarters, at the gas station, with the radio. His place was here, at the map, not on the battlefield. Beck came on the radio at 4:30 a.m. The teams were in position. The motel's perimeter was sealed off. No movement inside. They were asleep. Dan said, go ahead. It was all over in 8 minutes. The first team entered through the front door and the windows simultaneously. The second team went through the back door into the basement. The third team secured the ravine. Redneck and his men were asleep. Some didn't even have time to wake up. Those who did wake up and reached for their weapons were pinned to the floor. 3 were wounded. One of the system fighters suffered a knife cut to his forearm. Redneck turned out to have not 3, but 2 guns. Both were found under his mattress. He didn't have time to reach them. Beck personally subdued him and forced him to his knees. The basement. Mika went in there with a flashlight and then couldn't speak in a steady voice for 2 hours. 28 people, 16 women, 8 children, 4 elderly people, in a windowless basement, on the concrete floor, on rags. A bucket in the corner served as a toilet. The stench made the soldiers' eyes water. The children didn't cry. They had forgotten how to cry. They sat there and stared at the people who entered with that empty gaze that made you want to smash through the wall. Sarah arrived an hour later, with medicine, with water, with assistance. She examined everyone. Dehydration, exhaustion, signs of beatings. One woman had a broken arm that had healed improperly. An elderly man had a urinary tract infection. 3 children had skin parasites. Sarah worked in silence, methodically, with no emotion on her face. But Dan saw her knuckles turn white as she applied the bandages. Redneck was brought to Dan around noon. A large man, a red beard, small eyes. His hands were tied behind his back, a bruise on his cheekbone from Beck. He looked at Dan and couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. A skinny guy at a table with a notebook. Not a warrior, not a leader. Who was he? Dan didn't bother to explain. He asked 3 questions. Not the same 3 he asked everyone, different ones. How much food was on the farm? Where it was stored? Which of his men knew how to take care of chickens and pigs? The redneck spat, said Dan was finished, that his friends would come, that the syndicate was protecting him. Dan looked at him calmly. He said, "The syndicate is 60 kilometers away. Dan has 100 fighters across the road. The math is simple. No one's coming. No one's going to help. Redneck has a choice. Cooperate and live, or resist and sit in the same basement where his captive sat, on the same rags, with the same bucket. Justice is when the rules are the same for everyone." Redneck turned pale. Dan's tone scared him more than the fighter's automatic weapons. Because automatic weapons are understandable, but a calm, skinny guy who talks about a basement and a bucket as if they were items on an expense report, that's incomprehensible. And the incomprehensible is frightening. Redneck started talking. He laid it all out. The farm, the chickens, the pig, the vegetable patches, who worked there, who knows what to do, where the stash of gasoline is hidden, 20 liters, a fortune in the wasteland. Dan took notes. Then he ordered them to take Redneck away and lock him up. Not in the basement, in a separate room, with water and rations. Because even Redneck is a resource. Not now, later. Out of Redneck's 20 men, 14 agreed to switch sides to Dan's on the very first day. 6 refused. Dan didn't force them. He gave each one a day's ration and let them go. He said, "Go wherever you want, but if you come back with weapons, we'll treat you as enemies." The 6 headed west and were never seen again. Dan handed the farm over to Frank. The old farmer walked among the garden beds, shaking his head. The land was battered, exhausted, but alive. The chickens were skinny but laying eggs. The pig was thin but healthy. Frank said, "Give me 2 months and 5 men, and this farm will feed 50 mouths." Dan said, "You have 6 weeks and 10 people. You'll manage." Frank looked at him, nodded, and went over to his chickens. 28 former redneck captives became residents of Ashford. Not workers, not debtors, residents. Dan gave them food, shelter, medicine, and time. A week with no obligations, just to get their bearings. After that, those who wanted to could work. Those who didn't could live on a minimal ration. No pressure. Evelyn took 8 children into her home. Now she had 23 students. The school that Curtis had finished building on the 32nd day was almost full. Desks made of planks. A blackboard made from a piece of plywood painted black. Chalk. Real chalk. They found a whole box of it in the basement of a former stationery store. Evelyn stood at the blackboard with chalk in her hand and wrote letters. A, B, C. The children sat at their desks and watched. Some had never seen letters before. For them, it was magic. Real magic. The system recorded the capture of South Ashford. Reward, 100 system fighters, 2 armored pickup trucks, and a long-range radio set. 200 fighters, 2 transport vehicles, a radio with a range of 100 kilometers. Dan stood on the roof of the gas station and looked out at his city. Yes, a city. No longer just a neighborhood, not a base, a city. Over 200 people. A bakery, a field hospital, a school, a farm, a wall, a water tower, croplands in Creek Hollow. And this was only the beginning. Day 36. Dan turned on the long-range radio. The signalman set up the equipment on the school roof. An antenna made of metal pipes, a receiver and transmitter from the standard kit, frequencies ranging from 2 to 30 megahertz, the shortwave band, reaching beyond the horizon. They spent the first day listening. The airwaves were almost dead, static, crackling, snippets of someone's conversations on incomprehensible frequencies. Then, by morning, a communications specialist named Tobias picked up a signal. Clear, regular, encrypted transmissions every 6 hours. The source was to the south. Estimated distance, 50 to 100 kilometers. The code was simple, military format. Tobias decoded it in an hour. It was the syndicate, their internal communications, summaries, reports, troop movements. Dan sat and listened to the decrypted messages that Tobias was writing out by hand. The syndicate had taken 2 more villages over the past week, one in the southwest, one in the south. A convoy of 5 pickup trucks is moving northwest. Garrett Wayne requests a report on Ashford. Intelligence response. Ashford is fortified. A wall. Armed patrols. Strength unknown but estimated at 50 to 70 fighters. Recommendation. Surveillance. Do not engage until further notice. Dan reread the decryption. 50 to 70. They didn't know about the second group of fighters. Syndicate intelligence had only seen the first wave. Good. Let them think that. Let them think this is a minor operation. The longer they underestimate Ashford, the more time Dan has. He called Beck. He showed her the transcript. Beck read it. Her face didn't flicker, but her eyes hardened. She said, 2 weeks, maybe 3. Then they'll be done with the southern settlements and turn toward us. Dan nodded. 2 or 3 weeks. That's faster than he'd expected. The syndicate had picked up the pace. That meant the plan had to change. He called a full council meeting, an expanded one. Not 10 people, but 15. He added Willie, Frank, Curtis, Ruth, and Burke from Creek Hollow via radio. He laid out the situation. The syndicate would be here in 2 or 3 weeks, not in 3 months as they'd previously thought. The question was, what to do? Beck spread out the map and pointed it out. The syndicate was coming from the south, the main column. 5 armored pickup trucks, 10 fighters in each, plus infantry. A total of about 150 to 200 men, plus rear units, a supply train, prisoners, total up to 300. Against Ashford's 200 fighters, that's roughly an even match. But the syndicate has fuel and mobility. They can strike from any direction. Ashford is stuck in one place. Grant proposed a static defense. Pull all forces into the city, fortify the walls, wait behind the perimeter, let them come and break their teeth. Beck shook her head. A static defense is a siege. The syndicate won't scale the walls. They'll surround the city and wait. They have gasoline. They can bring in food and water. Ashford can't. After a month of siege, the town will start to starve. After 2 months, it will collapse. Dan listened. Then he said, Beck is right. We can't defend ourselves. But we can't launch a head-on attack either. So that leaves a third option. Not the wall and not the sword. Logistics. He walked over to the map. He picked up a pencil. He drew a line from Veroni Broad to Ashford. Then he marked 3 dots along that line. 3 settlements the syndicate hadn't taken yet. Their route passes through them. He said, the syndicate is a machine. A machine runs on fuel. Their fuel is gasoline, food, and information. If we cut off their supplies, the machine will grind to a halt. We don't need to defeat the syndicate. We need to unplug it. Point 1. Envoys. Send people to every village along the syndicate's route. Offer help, food, and protection in exchange for cooperation. If the settlements switch sides to Ashford, the syndicate will lose its supply points. It'll have to haul everything with it. And hauling that load for 100 kilometers is tough, even with pickup trucks. Point 2. Disinformation. The syndicate is listening to the airwaves. That means we can feed them false information. Broadcast fake conversations on open frequencies. Talk about reinforcements from the eastern settlements, about heavy weaponry, about minefields on the approaches. Let them think that Ashford is a fortress they can break their teeth on. Point 3. Fake warehouses. If the syndicate does make it to Ashford, the first thing it'll do is look for food. Its motivation is simple, to take the grain and the people. So we need to show it food, but not the real kind. Fake food. Fake warehouses on the outskirts of town, stuffed with empty crates and filled with sand. Props. The syndicate will come in, seize the warehouse, open the crates, and find sand. While they're figuring it out, Ashford's real supplies will be safe, in underground storage facilities that only Dan knows about. Beck listened. She looked at the map. Then she said, "This isn't a defense plan. It's a plan to manage chaos. It's madness." Dan replied, "It's logistics under conditions of scarcity. Every day the syndicate wastes on false targets is a day Ashford uses to strengthen its defenses. Time is a resource, the most valuable one." Beck was silent. Then she said, I need 3 days to prepare. Dan said, you have 2. On the 38th day, Mika and 2 fighters headed south, toward the village of Danville, 40 kilometers, the first stop on the syndicate's route, a small village, 2020. Mika was carrying a sack of flour, 10 kilos, and a note from Dan. The note contained a proposal: protection in exchange for information. If the syndicate approached Danville, the residents would warn Ashford via radio. In response, Ashford would take in the refugees, all of them, no exceptions, with food and shelter. On the 39th, Ji-yeon and Henrik began building fake warehouses, 2 buildings on the southern outskirts, boarded-up windows, locked doors. Inside, empty supply crates stuffed with rocks and dirt, burlap sacks on top. It looks like a real warehouse. It smells like a real warehouse. Ji-yeon even sprinkled flour on the floor by the entrance, for authenticity. On the 40th day, Tobias began transmitting fake communications over open frequencies, in Grant's voice. Supposedly a request for reinforcements from the eastern sector. Supposedly confirmation of the delivery of heavy weapons. Supposedly coordination of the mining of the southern approaches. It all sounded plausible, because Grant knew military jargon and Tobias knew radio protocols. Dan sat in headquarters, listening to transcripts of intercepted syndicate communications. 2 days after the disinformation campaign began, the tone of the messages changed. Intelligence requested additional data on Ashford. Twice instances. Garrett Wayne demanded clarification on troop strength and weaponry. Intelligence response: the data is contradictory, possibly up to 300 fighters, possibly heavy weaponry. Recommendation: postpone the offensive on Ashford. First, consolidate current positions. Dan read the transcript and let out a breath. For the first time in 40 days. It's working. The disinformation is working. The syndicate has slowed down. It hasn't stopped, but it had slowed down. Every day of delay is a day for Ashford, a day for the crops, a day for the wall, a day for the people. On the evening of the 40th day, Khan served dinner, a communal meal, on a long table in the gas station courtyard. 120 people at the table. Not everyone. The rest were on guard duty. But 120 was more than there had ever been. Bean soup with greens, bread, water, clean, from the tower through the Gyeong filter. It tasted like water, just water. But the people who had spent 10 years drinking rusty sludge from puddles drank this water and couldn't stop. Dan sat at the end of the table. He was eating his ration. Standard. No more, no less. Hannah stood by the pot and ladled out the soup, calling out each person's name. She knew all the names, all 200 plus of them, and she never got a portion wrong. On the 42nd day, Mika returned from Danville, with good news and bad. The good news: Danville had agreed. The town leader, named Whitney, said yes. She accepted the radio. She accepted the flour. She promised to warn them if the syndicate approached. The bad news: on the way back, Mika stumbled upon fresh tracks, tire tracks, heavy ones. Not motorcycles, cars, 2 of them. They ran parallel to the road half a kilometer to the west, heading south to north, straight toward Ashford. Dan called Beck. Beck called Grant. Grant called the fighters. 15 minutes later, the entire southern and western perimeter was on full alert. Lookouts were stationed on the watchtowers. Patrols were doubled. Ashford's pickup trucks were deployed to the southern outskirts. Engines were turned off. They waited. Nothing happened. Not that night, nor the next. The tracks led past Ashford. Maybe they weren't syndicate fighters. Maybe they were traitors. Maybe refugees in stolen cars. But Dan didn't stand down for another 3 days. Better to be safe than to die from overconfidence. On the 45th day, he decided he couldn't wait any longer. The syndicate had slowed down, but hadn't stopped. Sooner or later, it would arrive. And when it did, Dan needed to have not just 200 fighters, but more. Many more. The system provided people based on territory. That meant he needed territory. The 2 remaining settlements to the west and north of Ashford, Hopewell and Miller Creek. If we took them under our control, that would fulfill another condition: more fighters, more resources. Dan called Mika. He told her, 2 settlements, 2 days, reconnaissance, what's there, who's there, what do they want? Mika left at dawn. She returned a day and a half later. Hopewell, 27 people, farmers, peaceful, frightened. They have a well, 3 cows, and a plot of land where corn grows. They're willing to do anything as long as they're left alone. Miller Creek, more complicated. 35 people. They have an old mill, hand-cranked, stone. It works. They grind grain for the surrounding settlements in exchange for food. The oldest woman there is named Dorian, tough, distrustful, doesn't want to bow down to anyone, wants to trade, on equal terms. Dan thought, Hopewell is simple, same method, protection in exchange for cooperation, especially since they have cows. Milk provides the calories the children are lacking. Miller Creek is a job for a negotiator, and he is that negotiator. On the 47th day, Dan left Ashford for the first time. He took Mika, 10 fighters, and 1 pickup truck with him. He drove to Miller Creek in person. Beck was against it. She said the manager shouldn't leave the perimeter when there's a threat of attack. Dan replied that the manager needs to be where key decisions are made, and the mill is a key decision. Without the mill, the grain from Creek Hollow is useless. It's just grain. With the mill, it's flour. And flour is bread. And bread is everything. Miller's Creek turned out to be a settlement of a dozen or so houses surrounding the stone mill building. The building was old, sturdy, thick walls, a stone millstone inside, hand-cranked, 4 men turning the handle. The grain turns into flour, slowly, laboriously, but it works. The only working mill within 100 kilometers. Dorian met him at the entrance, a woman in her 50s, sturdy, with a stern gaze, her hands folded across her chest. Behind her stood 4 men with axes, not for attack, for demonstration. Dan got out of the pickup truck, alone. The fighters stayed in the truck. He walked up to Dorian. He introduced himself. His name is Dan Cross. He's the manager of Ashford. He came not to fight, but to trade. Dorian said, Traders don't usually come with 10 men armed with automatic weapons, Dan replied. The men with automatic weapons aren't for her. They're for whoever we might run into along the way. The road isn't safe right now. Dorian knows that better than he does. Dorian didn't let her guard down, but the axes behind her back dropped slightly. Dan proposed. Not an alliance, not submission, a trade agreement. Ashford supplies Miller Creek with grain from Creek Hollow. Miller Creek grinds it into flour. The flour is split evenly. Half stays with Miller Creek, half goes to Ashford. Plus, Ashford provides Miller Creek with medical care. Sarah will come once a week. Checkups, treatment, free of charge, plus protection. 1 patrol pickup truck with fighters passes through Miller Creek every day. If anyone tries to get to the mill, they'll face a response. Dorian listened. Then she said, But what if the syndicate comes? Dan said, If the syndicate comes, they'll come for everyone, for Ashford and for Miller Creek. The difference is that Ashford can put up a fight, but Miller Creek can't. 35 people with axes against armored pickup trucks? That's not a fight. That's a funeral. Together, we have a better chance. No guarantee, but a better one. Dorian thought for a long time. About 5 minutes. That was longer than Burke from Creek Hollow, longer than Willie. Dorian wasn't starving. She wasn't being backed into a corner. She was making a conscious choice. Then she said, 50-50 for the torment. Dan nodded. 50-50. Dorian held out her hand. Dan shook it. Dorian's hand was like a rock. On the way back, Mika sat in the pickup's cab and said nothing. Then she said, You really aren't afraid. Dan looked at her. He said, He's afraid every second. Every morning he wakes up, and his first thought is how many days until the syndicate. His second thought is how many mouths to feed. His third is what's going to break today. The fourth is who's going to get sick. The fifth is who's going to betray him. He's not brave. He's just busy. There's simply no room for fear in his schedule. Mika snorted, the first time she'd done so in front of him. Then she quickly turned away toward the window. But Dan noticed that she smiled slightly. Hopewell joined without any negotiations. Mika went to see them the next day. She showed them the flour. She showed them the walkie-talkie. She said that Ashford was taking them under his wing. The Hopewell town clerk, a man named Thomas, nodded so quickly he nearly broke his neck. 3 cows, milk, calories for the children. Dan jotted it down in his notebook. The supply chain, grain from Creek Hollow, flour from Miller Creek, milk from Hopewell, bread from Ashford, 4 nodes, 4 links, a chain. The system flashed. Condition, establish control over 3 settlements outside Ashford. Completed. Reward, 150 system soldiers, engineering platoon, 20 men, specialization, construction and fortification, medical supplies, expanded, fuel supply, 500 liters, 350 fighters, 4 pickup trucks, radio communication, engineering platoon, 500 liters of gasoline. Dan looked at the numbers and, for the first time, thought of a word he hadn't used before. Army. This is already an army. Beck thought the same thing. She stood nearby, watching the new fighters lining up in the square in front of the gas station, in 3 ranks, in uniform, armed. She said quietly, "If we add the civilian militia, that's 400 people, against 200 or 300 from the syndicate. Numerical superiority." Dan nodded, but he said, "Numbers aren't everything. The syndicate has mobility, experience, brutality. They've been fighting for 10 years. Ashford's fighters have never been in a real battle, except for the Redneck operation, and Redneck isn't the syndicate, not even close to the syndicate." Beck agreed. She said she needed time to prepare. Training, shooting practice, tactical exercises in defense and counterattack. 2 weeks at least. Dan gave her 2 weeks, and he said, "But be prepared for the fact that you might not have them." On the 50th day, Ashford looked like a city, a real one. A wall around the entire perimeter, 3 gates, 4 watchtowers. The bakery runs 2 shifts. The infirmary treats 10 patients a day. The school teaches 30 children. The mill at Miller Creek grinds grain. The fields in Creek Hollow are turning green with the first sprouts. The water tower provides clean water. Geong's wind turbine powers 3 buildings. The population of Ashford and the surrounding settlements has surpassed 400 people. On the evening of the 50th day, Dan stood on the wall and looked south. Quiet, dark, stars, a clear sky, the first in a long time. The acid clouds had drifted west. The air smelled of earth and bread and something else. Hope, perhaps, if hope has a scent. Beck stood beside him, in silence. They often stood like that, on the wall, in the evenings. They didn't speak. They just stood there. 2 people who knew that in a week or 2, all of this could be destroyed, and who were doing everything they could to prevent that from happening. Beck said, "You know we might lose." Dan replied, "I know, but losing while trying is better than losing by giving up." Beck looked at him. She didn't say anything, but she stood a little closer than before. On the 53rd day, a signal came from Danville. Whitney came on the radio. Her voice was shaking. "The syndicate is here. 5 cars. They drove through the village, didn't stop, kept going, north, toward Ashford." Dan acknowledged the message. He glanced at his watch. 40 kilometers, an hour by car, maybe an hour and a half on these rough roads. He turned to Grant. He said one word, "Alert." 12 minutes later, Ashford was on high alert. Beck had drilled this during exercises. Everyone knew their place. Everyone knew their task. Fighters on the wall. Fighters in reserve, pickup trucks in position, civilians in shelters. The school was closed. The children were in the school basement with Evelyn. The infirmary was ready to receive the wounded. Sarah was checking the medical supplies. Hannah had moved the supplies to the underground storage area. Ji-yun had shut down the wind turbine so the city wouldn't be given away by the rotation of the blades. Mika had moved out to the southern observation post, the highest point, the roof of a 3-story building on the outskirts. From there, you can see 5 kilometers in a straight line. An hour later, she made contact. "I see dust, south, 3 kilometers, moving slowly. Looks like a reconnaissance mission, not a convoy. 2 vehicles, not 5. Dan exchanged glances with Beck. 2 vehicles, not 5. So the syndicate has split up. The main convoy is somewhere behind. The vanguard is ahead. A combat reconnaissance unit or a negotiation team. Or a trap," Beck said. "Do we let them through or intercept them?" Dan said, "Let them approach, up to the gate, no further. Let them see the wall. Let them see the fighters on the wall. Let them figure it out." 2 syndicate pickup trucks appeared 40 minutes later, black, with armor plates welded to the sides, a mounted machine gun on the roof of one of them, a crow painted on the hoods, in white paint, the syndicate's emblem. They drove up to the south gate and stopped 100 meters away. They didn't turn off the engines. A man got out of the first pickup truck, tall, in a leather jacket, no weapon in his hands, but with a pistol on his hip. He raised his hands, palms forward, a negotiator's gesture. Dan was standing on the wall. He looked down at him. Beck and Grant stood nearby. On either side of the gate, fighters with assault rifles were taking cover. No trap. These were genuine negotiations. The man below spoke up, loudly, in a controlled voice. He said his name was Reed, that he represented Garrett Wayne, that the Crow's Brood Syndicate was offering Ashford terms. Peaceful, simple. Ashford would recognize the syndicate's authority, hand over 30% of its food reserves, provide a workforce, 50 people, on a permanent basis, for the syndicate's needs. In exchange, the syndicate guarantees protection from external threats and will not harm the residents. The response deadline is 24 hours. Silence on the wall. Dan listened and did the math. 30% of the food supply is 3 metric tons. 50 workers are slaves. Protection from external threats is extortion. The syndicate was offering its standard deal, the same one it applied to everyone else. Submission in exchange for the absence of violence. Pay up and live. Don't pay, and you'll end up hanging from a road sign. Dan looked at Beck. Beck was looking at him. Her face was stony, waiting for a decision. Dan turned to Reed. He spoke calmly and loudly so everyone could hear, both those on the wall and down by the pickup trucks. Tell Garrett Wayne 3 things. First, Ashford doesn't recognize anyone else's authority. Second, Ashford doesn't hand over people, not a single one. Third, if the syndicate wants to negotiate, Dan is ready to discuss the terms. On equal footing, at the table. No machine guns on the rooftops. If the syndicate wants to fight, Dan is ready for that too. And he suggests that Wayne take stock of his resources before making a decision, because Dan has already taken stock of his. Reed listened. His expression didn't change. Then he nodded, turned around, got into the pickup truck. The vehicles drove off toward the south. The dust slowly settled. Everyone on the wall was silent. Then Grant exhaled. He said, "Well, that's it. Now it's war." Beck said, "No, not yet. Wayne will try to intimidate us first. He'll show his strength. He'll drive by. He'll fire shots into the air. He'll try to intercept the caravan. Or strike one of the Allied settlements. He'll test our resolve. The real war will begin when he realizes that Ashford can't be broken with a single blow." Dan nodded. He said, "Then let's prepare for the test. And first things first, we'll warn Creek Hollow, Miller Creek, and Hopewell. We'll step up road patrols, move all supplies to underground storage facilities, shut down the decoy warehouses." Beck replied, "No, we're not shutting down the decoy warehouses. On the contrary, we'll make them more conspicuous. If the syndicate strikes, let them strike at those. Let them waste their energy and time on empty crates." Dan looked at her. He nodded. He said, "Beck, you're starting to think like a manager." Beck didn't smile, but something flashed in her eyes. Maybe acknowledgement, maybe a challenge, maybe both. On the 54th day, the syndicate struck. Not at Ashford, at Hopewell. At night. 3 cars, 30 fighters. A quick raid, break in, grab, get out. Standard tactics. They didn't know there was a patrol of 2 Ashford fighters was stationed in Hopewell, with radios, with assault rifles, with night watch posts. Beck had stationed them there 3 days earlier, because Beck thought like a manager, and like an officer. She calculated that the syndicate would strike at the weakest link. Hopewell was the weakest link, so Hopewell needed to be reinforced. The battle lasted 20 minutes. The syndicate didn't expect any resistance. They drove up in the open, without reconnaissance, confident that a village of 27 farmers had nothing to offer in the way of resistance. The first pickup truck came under crossfire from 2 positions. The driver was killed. The truck came to a stop across the road. The second pickup tried to drive around it. It got stuck on the shoulder. The third turned around and drove off. The syndicate fighters who had managed to get out fought back for about 5 minutes. Then they ran. 7 were taken prisoner. 5 were killed. The rest fled south. Ashford's casualties? 2 wounded, 1 seriously, a bullet in the thigh. Sarah worked on him for 4 hours. She removed the bullet. Dan learned about the firefight 10 minutes after it began, over the radio. He was sitting in headquarters, listening. He couldn't do anything but listen. That was the worst part. Worse than fear, worse than hunger. Sitting there and listening to his men fight, unable to help right then and there. Every shot over the radio was someone's choice between life and death, and he sitting in a chair, waiting. When the battle ended and Grant reported that Hopewell had been secured, Dan dropped his head onto the table and sat like that for a minute. Then he looked up. Then he started counting. Trophies. 2 pickup trucks, 1 damaged, 1 in working order. Weapons. 6 assault rifles, 4 handguns, 200 rounds of ammunition. Syndicate ammo. High quality, factory made. 7 prisoners. Syndicate fighters, rank and file, low-level henchmen, but sources of information. Dan ordered the prisoners to be taken to Ashford. He interrogated them himself, not with his fists, with questions. 3 questions. What's your name? How old are you? What did you do before joining the syndicate? The prisoners expected to be beaten or shot. Instead, they got questions, and food, and water, and a warm place to sleep, 4 of them started talking within the first hour. They said the syndicate was 30 kilometers to the south. Their main base was in the former village of Stonebridge. 200 fighters, 5 armored pickup trucks, one of them equipped with a heavy machine gun, supplies, 2 months' worth of food, 1 month's worth of gasoline. Garrett Wayne is at the base, in person, waiting for the results of the reconnaissance in force. Dan listened. He took notes. He did the math. 200 fighters, 5 pickup trucks, 2 months' worth of food, 1 month's worth of gasoline. Impressive, but not invincible. Wayne won't launch a head-on assault on Ashford after what happened in Hopewell. He lost a pickup truck and men in a small town. He'll reassess the situation. Ashford is not an easy target. It's an enemy. So Wayne would act like a soldier. Reconnaissance, blockade, isolation, a strike against the supply lines, the classics. Dan knew the classics, not the military ones, the logistical ones. The competitive war between warehouse operators in the Midwestern market, intercepting routes, dumping, poaching customers. Different words, same principles. Whoever controls the supply chain wins. He opened his notebook, a real one, a paper one, the one Evie had sewn for him from scraps of notebooks. He wrote, Day 54, first battle with the syndicate. Victory. Hopewell held. Casualties minimal. Wayne will regroup. We have a week, maybe 2. Use every hour. Tasks. Fortify all settlements. Move supplies underground. Finish the wall. Prepare a plan for a counter-logistics operation. No, not a counter-offensive. Counter-logistics. Cut Wayne off from his supplies. Force him to count every liter of gasoline and every kilogram of grain. Turn his war into bookkeeping. And in bookkeeping, the one who counts best wins. He closed his notebook. He looked at the map on the wall, at the dots. Ashford, Creek Hollow, Miller Creek, Hopewell, Danville. 5 dots, 5 links. A chain that the syndicate had tried to break and failed. So far, at least. But it would try again, and again, and again, until it breaks, or until he breaks first. Dan knew what would happen next. Not because he could see the future, because he knew his arithmetic. Wayne has a month's worth of gas. Dan has fields that will yield their first harvest in 6 weeks. Wayne is burning through resources. Dan is producing resources. This isn't a war. It's a race to exhaustion. And in this race, the winner isn't the one with the most guns. It's the one with the longest supply chain. On the 56th day, Dan launched an operation he called Dry Tap to himself. Not loudly, not grandly. He simply jotted down 2 words in his notebook and got to work. The idea was simple. The syndicate has a month's worth of gas. Gas is the lifeblood of their vehicles. Without gas, their pickup trucks are just scrap metal. Without pickup trucks, the syndicate is on foot. Infantry 30 kilometers out without supplies is as good as dead. So mission number 1, gas. Prevent Wayne from restocking. Mika found out through interrogating prisoners that the syndicate gets its gas from a single source, a former oil storage facility southeast of Stonebridge. There are tanker trucks there, 3 of them, half full. That's Wayne's entire supply. Without those tankers, he has nowhere to get fuel. Refining oil is an industrial process. No one in the wasteland knows how to replicate it. Dan called Beck over. He spread out the map. He pointed out the oil storage facility. He asked, "Is it possible?" Beck looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "A sabotage team. 10 people, at night, go around Stonebridge from the east, get to the storage facility, dump the gas into the ground, or set it on fire. Setting it on fire is more reliable." Dan shook his head. "Don't set it on fire. The fire can be seen from kilometers away. It'll attract attention. Pour it out, quietly. Open the valves and leave. By the time the syndicate notices, it'll be too late. The gasoline will seep into the ground. The tanks will be empty. Wayne will be stranded." Beck thought for a moment. Then she said, "It's complicated, but it's possible." She needs a guide who knows the area around Stonebridge. Dan looked at Knox. Knox was standing against the wall, listening. He said, "He knows. He was there 2 years ago. He walked through those ravines at night." Beck said, "Then you're coming with me." Dan said, "Beck, you're not going." Beck turned to him. Her eyes hardened. She said, "She's an officer. A sabotage operation requires a commander on the ground, not a sergeant, a commander." Dan said, "She's the only officer in Ashford. If she gets killed, the city's defenses will fall apart. Grant's good, but Grant isn't Beck. Knox will lead this operation." Beck clenched her jaw. She wanted to argue. Then she looked at Dan, at his face, calm, unyielding. The face of a man who had made a decision and wouldn't back down. She saw that face in the mirror every morning. She recognized it, and she backed down. She said, "All right, but I'll prepare the team myself." The team set out on the 58th day. At night, 10 people, led by Knox, 8 of the best system fighters, and Mika. She'd insisted on coming herself. Dan didn't want to let her go. Mika said that without her, the team would get lost. She was the only one who'd traveled these roads in the last month. Dan looked at her. She stood tall, with a scar across her eyebrow, a radio on her belt, with a knife on her hip. 22 years old, a former courier scout who'd come to him 3 months ago, alone and hungry. Now the head of intelligence, with a say in matters, with a rank, with a name. Dan said, "Come back alive. That's an order." Mika snorted. She said, "That's not an order. It's a request." And she walked off into the darkness. 3 days of silence. Dan didn't sleep. He sat by the radio, waiting. Hannah brought him food and tea. He ate mechanically, counted the hours, counted the distance. 30 kilometers there, a detour, the approach to the storage facility, the job, withdrawal. 30 kilometers back, at least 3 days. On the 61st day, the radio came to life. Miki's voice, quiet, calm. 3 words. "The valves are open. Let's go." Dan closed his eyes. He exhaled. He opened his eyes. He looked at Beck, who was standing nearby. Beck nodded. She said, "Now let's count." Counting was simple. 3 tanks, half full. That's about 15 to 20,000 liters. If the valves are fully open, the gas will run out in 8 to 10 hours. By morning, the tanks will be empty. The syndicate will be left with only what's in the pickup truck's tanks, 200 to 300 liters. Enough for 3 to 4 days of active travel. Then that's it. The group returned on the 62nd day. Everyone was alive, not a single casualty. Knox reported that the storage facility was unguarded, just 2 guards. They were asleep. The group slipped past them like a shadow. They opened the valves on all 3 tanks. Then they left the same way they came. On the way back, they heard noise coming from the direction of Stonebridge. Shouts. Maybe they were spotted, maybe not. It doesn't matter. The job's done. Dan shook Knox's hand, then Mika's. Mika looked at him. She said quietly, "You haven't slept in 3 days." Dan replied, 4. Mika said, "Go to sleep. The world won't end in 6 hours." Dan almost smiled. He went to sleep, for the first time in 4 days. Intercepted syndicate communications confirmed everything the next day. Wayne was furious. The storage facility was empty. The gasoline was buried. One of the guards had been hanged for negligence. Wayne demanded a report. He demanded to know who was responsible. He demanded a plan. His officers remained silent because there was no plan. Without gasoline, the pickup trucks are out of commission. Without pickup trucks, the syndicate is just heavily armed infantry with nowhere to go. Dan listened to the transcripts and did the math. Wayne has 2 weeks, maybe 3. Then his men will start starving because, without transport, food supplies from the captured settlements will dry up. Hungry people desert. Deserters scatter. The syndicate falls apart. Not from bullets, from arithmetic. But Dan knew Wayne from the transcripts. Wayne isn't a fool. Wayne is a former sergeant who, for 10 years, held together a conglomerate of 3 gangs through sheer will and charisma. He won't sit back and wait. He'll strike, with the last thing he has left, desperately, furiously, with all the rage of a cornered beast. And that strike will be the most dangerous. Dan opened his notebook. He wrote, "Day 62. Wayne will strike within the week, with whatever he has left. We need to be ready. We need to hold out just once. Just once. After that, he'll have nothing left to mount a second strike." The strike came on the 66th day, not from the south, from the west. Wayne had flanked us. He abandoned the pickup trucks with their last drops of gas. He loaded the people onto them and set out on foot across the wasteland. He bypassed Ashford from the west and struck at Miller Creek. Mika spotted them 6 hours before the strike. A patrol on the western road noticed dust. A lot of dust. A column on foot. At least 150 people, moving fast, heading for Miller Creek. Dan received the message. He clenched his teeth. Wayne thought like a soldier. Don't attack head-on. Strike at their supply lines. The mill is the key link. Without the mill, there's no flour. Without flour, there's no bread. Without bread, Ashford weakens. Wayne thought the same way as Dan, just from a different angle. 6 hours. That's not much time. Miller Creek is 20 kilometers away. Ashford's pickup trucks could deliver reinforcements in 40 minutes. But Beck had said, not reinforcements, an army, the whole thing. This isn't a raid, it's a full-scale battle. Wayne had put everything on the line, so Dan had to respond with everything he had. Dan hesitated for 3 seconds. Then he said, Grant, leave 50 fighters to defend Ashford. The remaining 300 go with Beck. All the pickup trucks, all the weapons. We're moving out to Miller Creek, immediately. Beck nodded. She turned around, and in 40 minutes, she had assembled an army. The Ashford convoy set out, 4 pickup trucks, 300 fighters, half in the vehicles, half running along the road on foot. Beck rode in the first pickup, Dan in the second, with a radio, with a map, with a notepad. His place was at headquarters, but headquarters was now the pickup's cab, because headquarters has to be where decisions are made. They made it, barely. As Ashford's convoy approached Miller Creek from the north, the syndicate's convoy was approaching from the west. 2 hours until contact. Beck used every minute. She deployed the fighters, 3 lines of defense, the first on the approaches to the village, in the trenches that Henrik's engineer platoon had been digging like mad for the last half hour. The second in the village itself, behind the houses, behind the walls, behind the mill. The third beyond the village, reserves for a counterattack, if there's anything to fight with. Dorian met Dan at the mill, calm, with an axe in her hand. She said, My people are ready. 35 of them, not fighters, but they're ready. Dan said, Dorian, your people aren't fighting. Your people are going down to the mill's basement and waiting. The mill's walls are thick, stone. A bullet won't penetrate them. It's safe there. Dorian gripped the axe. She said, She won't hide in the basement while others die for her mill. Dan looked at her. He said quietly, If she were killed, there would be no one left to run the mill after the battle. She was needed alive, not as a symbol, but as a specialist. She couldn't take any risks. It wasn't cowardice. It was logistics. Dorian clenched her jaw. Then she lowered her axe, turned around, and led her people into the basement. The battle began at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The syndicate emerged from behind the hills to the west, a long column on foot, gray, dusty, 170 men. Wayne had abandoned everyone. He'd left only the wounded and the supply train at the base. The best fighters led the way, with assault rifles, with grenades. Behind them came the main body, armed with whatever they could find, axes, pipes, sawed-off shotguns, an army of desperation. The front line met them with fire. The trenches had done their job. Beck's fighters fired from cover, accurately, sparingly. Every round counted. The syndicate took cover, returned fire, scattered, unprofessional. Most of Wayne's fighters weren't soldiers. They were thugs. They know how to rob and intimidate. They don't know how to storm a prepared defense. But Wayne did. He regrouped his men in 20 minutes. He directed the main assault at the right flank, where the trenches were shallower and there were fewer fighters. He broke through the first line. His men surged into the breach. Beck withdrew the first line to the second, in an organized manner, without panic, just like in training. Dan was sitting in a pickup truck outside the village. He was listening to the radio. He was looking at the map. He saw everything. Every report was a dot on the map. Every dot was a decision. He wasn't commanding the battle. Beck was doing that. He was in command of everything else. He moved the reserve platoon to the right flank to seal the breach. He ordered Mika to flank them from the east and move behind the syndicate's lines. Not to attack, just to show up. Let them see that they're being flanked. Let them panic. Mika moved in. The syndicate saw her, and they panicked. The rear ranks wavered. They started looking around. Someone ran, then another, a chain reaction. Beck struck at that moment, from the second line, head on, all her fighters at once. The syndicate crumbled. They retreated. They ran. Wayne didn't run. He stood on the hill with his pistol, trying to stop his men. He fired into the air. He shouted. It was useless. They ran past him, right through him. He was left alone, with an empty pistol, on the hill, facing 300 fighters. Beck approached him personally, with an assault rifle. She said, "Put your weapon on the ground." Wayne looked at her, then at the fleeing fighters. then at the Ashford army, which stood in a semicircle around the hill. He dropped the pistol. He said, "I want to speak with the person in charge." Beck said, "He's in the pickup truck behind the settlement, counting your casualties." They brought Wayne to Dan 20 minutes later. His hands were tied. He was wearing a dusty jacket. There was blood on his sleeve. Not his blood. A large man, about 45 years old, gray stubble, intelligent eyes. Angry, but intelligent. Wayne looked at Dan. At the skinny guy sitting at a folding table in the pickup's cab, with a notepad, with a walkie-talkie. He said he was expecting a warrior, but he sees an accountant. Dan replied. The accountant had checked Wayne's supplies. He didn't have any. Wayne was silent. Then he said, "What's next?" Dan said, "It's simple. The syndicate is disbanded. Wayne's men get a choice. Join Ashford on equal terms, a job, rations, protection, the law, or scatter in all directions, unarmed, with a day's rations. The settlements captured by the syndicate are being liberated. Prisoners are being released. Everything that was looted is being returned." Wayne said it, and he meant it. Dan looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "Wayne knows the wasteland better than anyone. He's crisscrossed it for 10 years. He knows every road, every settlement, every water source. That knowledge is valuable." Dan offers him a position, territorial consultant, unarmed, without authority, under supervision, but with rations, a roof over his head, and the chance to prove he's capable of building, not just destroying. Wayne stared at him. He said, "You're serious?" Dan replied, "Absolutely. A dead Wayne is revenge. A living Wayne is a resource. Dan doesn't seek revenge. Dan rules." Wayne was silent for a minute. Then he laughed, briefly, bitterly, without joy. He said, "Accountant. Damn accountant." After the Battle of Miller Creek, the world changed. Not immediately, not dramatically, but irreversibly. Dan spent the first 3 days on his feet, without sleep. 217 syndicate fighters surrendered or were captured within 2 days. Most of them walked out to the Ashford patrols on their own, hungry, lost, without commanders, without a purpose. Dan took each one in. 3 questions. What's your name? How old are you? What can you do? Leo filled 3 notebooks. Of the 217, 140 agreed to join Ashford. The rest left. Some headed east, some headed south, some simply into the wasteland. Dan didn't hold anyone back. A person held against their will is a ticking time bomb. Those who stayed of their own free will are the foundation. Stonebridge, the syndicate's former base, came under Ashford's control on the 70th day. Beck entered with 50 fighters, without a fight. The base was empty. The supply train had been looted by the syndicate's own fighters in the chaos following their defeat. But the buildings still stood. The walls, the roofs, the fence, a well, and the most valuable item of all, the syndicate's radio station, a powerful one, with a generator. Tobias inspected it and said that with this station, they could listen in on the entire Midwest. The system flashed. Condition met. Capture of syndicate territory. Unification of 5 or more settlements. Reward: 200 system fighters, a field hospital, expanded seed supply, 1,000 liters of fuel, and the line that Dan read 3 times. Status: available. Carnadon, ruler of the Confederation. Confirm. Dan didn't confirm. He closed the window. It wasn't time yet. Or maybe it wasn't his decision to make. He hadn't figured it out yet. On the 75th day, Dan called a grand council. Not at the gas station, at Evelyn's school. Around the long table Curtis had built for the teachers. Everyone came. Dan, Beck, Grant, Knox, Mika, Sarah, Ji-Yun, Henrik, Evelyn, Hannah, Willie, Dorian from Miller Creek, Burke from Creek Hollow, Thomas from Hopewell, Whitney from Danville. 15 people, representatives from 6 settlements, more than 1,000 people at this table, if you count those they represent. Dan stood up. He looked at everyone and said, "The war is over. The syndicate is no more. Now the question is, what next? They have 6 settlements, more than 1,000 people, a bakery, a mill, an infirmary, a school, a farm, fields, an army, a radio station. All of this needs to be united, not under a single person, under a single system, a confederation. Each settlement governs itself, its own leader, its own rules of daily life. But common matters are decided together: defense, trade, medicine, education, and the law. For this, there's a council, this very council. Each settlement has 1 vote. Decisions are made by majority. Dan will be the coordinator, not a ruler. A coordinator. His job is to keep the system running, nothing more. Silence. Then Dorian said, "What if the coordinator decides to become a ruler?" Dan replied, "Then the council will remove him, by a vote, a simple majority. It will be written into the charter, the first clause." Dorian nodded, slowly, respectfully. Burke said, "I'm in." Thomas said, "Me too." Whitney nodded silently. Leo wrote it all down. It was the third official document, the Carnarvon Confederation Charter, handwritten on notebook paper with signatures and check marks. The months passed more quickly. The third month, the fields in Creek Hollow yielded their first harvest, wheat. Short, thin, but real. Frank stood at the edge of the field, looking at the ears of wheat and saying nothing. His hands were shaking. He hadn't seen wheat in 20 years. The harvest was gathered by hand, with sickles that Ji-yun had forged from car springs. They threshed it with sticks on tarps spread out on the ground. The grain was taken to Miller Creek. Dorian started up the mill. 4 people turned the millstones. The grain turned into flour. The flour arrived in Ashford. Patty baked bread. The first bread made from their own grain, not from system reserves, from the earth. Dan cut off the first slice and gave to Frank. He said, "You grew this. You get the first piece." Frank took the bread. He took a bite. He chewed, and he cried, silently, without shame. An old farmer who hadn't seen his own harvest in 20 years. The 4th month. Sarah opened a second infirmary in Stonebridge. Ji-yun assembled the second wind turbine. Henrik finished building the wall around Miller Creek. Beck conducted the first joint review of the Confederate Army. 500 soldiers in formation, regulars and militiamen together, in uniform, armed, with insignia that Rachel had sewn by hand, the letter K on the sleeve, Carnarvon. Beck stood before the formation in her restored uniform, upright, with a scar on her cheekbone, with eyes that made you want to stand up straight. Dan stood beside her. He said quietly, "Major Holt, you're back in the ranks." Beck didn't turn around, but Dan saw the corner of her mouth twitch, just once, for half a second. That was enough. The 5th month, Hannah presented her report to the council. Under the food department's management, not a single person had died of starvation in the entire history of the Confederation. Not a single one, out of 1,200. Dan read that figure aloud. Then he said, "This is Hannah Cho's achievement, personally." Hannah stood against the wall, small, quiet, her hands folded in front of her. She didn't know where to look. Then she looked at Dan and smiled, for the first time in public in 5 years. The 6th month, a communal dinner, the second in Ashford's history. But now there weren't 200 people, 400. Long tables on Main Street, made of planks on trestles. Hannah and 12 cooks had been preparing for 3 days. Soup, bread, roast chicken, vegetables from the farm, compote made from dried apples they found in the Stonebridge basement. A real feast. Ji-yun hung the string of lights. She soldered each bulb herself, 20 of them, yellow, warm. They glowed above the tables like little suns. Evelyn's children stared at them with their mouths agape. Some of these children had never seen electric light before. Dan stood up. He looked around the table. 400 faces, familiar ones, every single one, by name. He opened his mouth to give a speech and couldn't. He stood silent for a while, 10 seconds. Then he said, "Thank you for coming. Eat while it's hot. We've got a lot of work tomorrow." And he sat down, and the whole table began to eat, in silence, some with tears in their eyes, others with smiles. Mika was pouring something strong from the system's reserves. Knox was eating and, for the first time in a long while, looked relaxed. Willie was sitting next to Curtis, and they were talking quietly about something. A former gangster and a former construction worker, now a foreman and a master craftsman. Beck stood off to the side, frowning. Then she sat down, next to Dan, not across from him, next to him. Sarah was sitting 2 seats away, in something that wasn't a work smock, a dress. An old one, patched up, but a dress. She'd put it on for the first time in 8 years. Dan noticed. He didn't say anything, but he noticed. On the 210th day, Tobias picked up a new signal. Not the syndicate. The syndicate was no more. Another one. Clean, professional, encrypted with a military code Tobias didn't know. A source in the east, far away, maybe 200 kilometers, maybe more. Transmissions came every 12 hours, short, precise. Whoever it was, they had discipline and equipment. Dan listened and said nothing. Then he told Tobias, "Keep recording. Every transmission, every byte." A week later, Tobias cracked the code. Not completely, partially, enough to understand. The Internal Reconstruction Division, Federal, call sign Gray Dawn. The transmissions contained reports about the wasteland, about Ashford, about the Confederation, about Dan. Someone had been watching them for a long time, professionally, and reporting to higher-ups. Dan read the decrypted messages. He sat down at the table, stared at the wall for a long time. Then he called Beck. Beck read them. Her face turned to stone. She said, "The Internal Reconstruction Division." She'd heard of them during the first year of the Gray. Rumors among National Guard officers. A semi-legal special service created to restore federal control over the interior territories after the collapse. No one knew who commanded them. No one knew their numbers. But everyone knew one rule. Any new leader in the wasteland must either swear allegiance to them or disappear. Dan said, "So they'll be here soon." They arrived on the 220th day. A helicopter, a real one, a military one, black. It landed in the square in front of the gas station, kicking up a cloud of dust. The residents of Ashford froze. Most of them hadn't seen flying machines since childhood. Evelyn's children stared at the helicopter as if it were a monster. 3 men stepped out of the helicopter, 2 in black uniforms, with assault rifles, security. The third was in civilian clothes, a man in his 60s, gray-haired, thin, with intelligent eyes behind thin-frame glasses. He walked calmly, without haste, like a man who knows he's expected. Dan met him at the gas station, standing, unarmed. Behind him were Beck, Grant, and 20 fighters. But Dan stepped forward, alone. The man stopped 3 steps away. He looked at Dan for a long time. Then he said, "Hello, Mr. Cross. My name is Dr. Ezra Tate, and we need to talk." They talked for 4 hours. At the gas station, at a table, tea from Hannah, bread from Patty. Beck wanted to stay. Dan asked her to leave. He said this was a conversation he had to have alone. Tate spoke calmly, methodically, like a scientist giving a lecture. He told them everything. Project Phoenix, a secret federal government program, launched 10 years before the Gray Year. The goal? To prepare for a possible collapse of civilization, to develop a recovery system, autonomous, self-sufficient, capable of nurturing a new leader out of the chaos. The system was shut down in the first year of the Gray Year. The government fled to the coasts. It abandoned the interior territory. It abandoned the project as well. But Tate didn't give up. He believed in the system. He continued the work. Alone. Underground. 40 years. He searched for the right candidate. Not a warrior. Not a politician. An administrator. A person who knows how to calculate and doesn't abuse power. Dan listened in silence. Then, Tate said something that took Dan's breath away. The body Dan had inhabited belonged to a young man named Daniel Cross, Jr., 20 years old. The grandson of a man named Daniel Cross, the very same one, the manager of the logistics hub near Cincinnati, who died in a car accident in 2024, who was, in fact, Dan. Dan stared at Tate. He couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. His grandson. He had no family, but after his death, someone carried on the line. Someone had a son. The son grew up and had a son, and this grandson survived the Gray Year and lived to be 20, and died of starvation in the wasteland, on the cold concrete of a gas station, alone. The system had chosen Dan's consciousness because it was searching for a family line with the right mindset. Dan hadn't ended up in a foreign world. He had ended up in a world where his own grandson had died of starvation, and he was living in his body. Dan sat at the table, and his hands wouldn't obey him. He looked at his palms, his grandson's palms, skinny, with blisters, young. And for the first time in all this, he couldn't count. The numbers wouldn't come. The notebook lay closed. Then Tate said one more thing. An accident. A highway at night. A guardrail. This wasn't an accident. Tate had staged the accident. Through the time shift system. A side effect of Project Phoenix. He had killed Dan in his past life. Deliberately. To transfer his consciousness here. Into this body. Into this time. Into this mission. Silence. Long. Heavy. Dan looked at Tate. At the old man with intelligent eyes who had waited 40 years, planned, and killed a man to save the world. Dan asked why he had come, why he had told him all this. He could have kept silent forever, Tate replied. Because the system has reached its final stage, the next level. If Dan confirms his status as ruler, the system will grant full access. Thousands of fighters, technology, resources, enough to rebuild half the continent. But for that, a ruler is needed, a real one, a confirmed one, with full authority. The internal reconstruction is ready to recognize the Carnadon Confederation if Dan accepts the status. Dan was silent. Then he said, "And if he doesn't accept it?" Tate replied, "Then the system will be deactivated. The fighters will disappear. The resources will dry up. The Confederation will remain what it is, 1,000 people with a mill and a bakery. Without an army, without protection, to be devoured by the next Wayne." Dan looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "He needs time. 24 hours. Tate nodded. He said, 24 hours. Night. Dan sat on the roof of the water tower, alone, a notebook on his lap, closed. He wasn't writing. He was thinking. The lights of Ashford were glowing below, small, yellow, alive. The bakery window, the infirmary window, Gion's string of lights above Main Street, smoke from the kitchen chimney where Hannah was cooking breakfast for the morning, the shadows of the sentries on the wall. Mickey's quiet voice over the radio, checking the posts, all quiet. A typical night in a town that 2.5 months ago had been a field of dead ruins. Dan looked at it all and thought of his grandson, of the young man he had never known. 20 years old, skinny, hungry, alone on the cold concrete, dying slowly, day after day, without food, without water, without a name. In a world where no one asked what your name was. Dan sat inside his body, breathed through his lungs, saw through his eyes, and built what this young man hadn't lived to build. He opened his notebook, reread the first entry. Day 1, inventory. What's there? What's is needed? Who the partners are. He flipped through the pages, day after day. Names, numbers, tasks, solutions. Every page is a step. Every step is a person. Malik, Knox, Frank, Ruth, Patty, Leo, Curtis, Willie, Evelyn, Ji-Yun, Sarah, Mika, Hannah, Beck, Henrik, Dorian, Burke, Thomas, Whitney. Hundreds of names, 1,200 people who know him by name and whom he knows by name. Tate offered power, real power, absolute power. Thousands of fighters, technology, resources. With this, you could rebuild more than just the wasteland. With this, you could rebuild the country, bring back electricity, bring back roads, bring back schools and hospitals and courts and the post office. Everything the world gave up 20 years ago. But at what cost? A ruler, not a coordinator, not a manager. A ruler with complete authority over every decision, over every life, over every loaf of bread. One man at the top of a system he didn't create and doesn't fully understand. A system that killed him so he would end up here. A system with an agenda, and he is a tool of that agenda, not the master. He remembered Wayne, power as order. Wayne believed in that, and he lost. But Wayne didn't lose because he was completely wrong. He lost because his power gave people no reason to live, only reasons to be afraid. Dan gave people reasons to live. Bread, a name, a job, a roof over their heads, a hospital, a school. But if he became ruler, what would stop him from becoming a second Wayne in 5 years? Or in 10? Power doesn't corrupt a person. Power simply removes the reasons to hold back. Dan closed his notebook. He came down from the tower. He walked through the city at night. He went into the infirmary. Sarah was awake. She was sitting by a patient's bed, a teenager with pneumonia. They'd brought her in from Stonebridge. Sarah was changing a compress, quietly, carefully. Her hands were steady, calm. The hands of a doctor who has the means to treat. Dan stood in the doorway.
Sarah noticed him. She looked at him. She didn't ask anything. She just looked. And in her gaze was something Dan hadn't seen before. Not gratitude, not admiration. Trust. Deep, quiet. The trust of someone who had stopped expecting the worst. Dan walked on, toward the school. He peered through the window. Desks in rows, a blackboard with letters written in chalk, children's drawings on the wall, houses, trees, the sun, not the yellow, murky sun of the wasteland, bright, round, with rays. The children had drawn a sun they'd never seen, because Evelyn had told them it could be like that. Dan walked to Ji-Yun's workshop. The light was on. Ji-Yun wasn't asleep. She was sitting at her workbench, soldering something.
Parts were laid out all around her. Gears, wires, hand-drawn schematics. A document hung on the wall in a wire frame. The first official appointment order, approved by engineer Park J. She had hung it up on her first day and hadn't taken it down. Dan went to the kitchen. Hana was standing by the stove, stirring, a small figure in the semi-darkness, a notebook on the table nearby, open, numbers, grams, portions, names, every day, every bowl, every mouth. 1,200 entries without a single mistake. Dan walked over to the wall. Beck was standing at the south post, straight, motionless, staring into the darkness. Uniform, a patch with the letter K on her sleeve, an automatic rifle slung over her shoulder. She heard his footsteps, didn't turn around, said, "Can't sleep." Dan said, "Can't sleep." Beck was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Tate offered you the crown." Dan wasn't surprised she knew. Beck knew everything that went on in Ashford. That's her job. He said, "Yeah, he did." Beck said, "And you don't know what to do." Dan said, "I know, I'm just checking." Beck turned to him. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said quietly, "Whatever you decide, I'll stay." Dan looked at her. He nodded. He didn't say anything, but he stood there for another 10 minutes, in silence, against the wall, above the sleeping city. In the morning, Dan met Tate at the gas station, at the same table. Tate looked as if he hadn't slept either. His glasses were slightly askew. His eyes were tired. He was waiting. Dan sat down across from him. He placed his notebook on the table. He opened it. 2 words were written on a blank page. My answer. Dan said he wouldn't be the ruler, not because he didn't want to, but because the Carnadon Confederation wasn't his property. It was 1,200 people who decided for themselves how to live. They had a council. They had a constitution. They had the right to vote. If Dan accepted the crown, he would take that right away from them, and then everything he's built would be meaningless. Because he wasn't building an empire. He was building a warehouse where people feel safe spending the night. And a warehouse doesn't need a king. A warehouse needs a manager. Tate listened. His expression didn't change. Then he said, "If Dan refuses, the system will deactivate. The fighters will disappear. Everything the system has provided will be gone." Dan replied. He knew. He'd done the math. Without the system's fighters, the Confederation would be left with the militia. 200 people, plus civilians, plus the wall, plus the mill, plus the fields, plus people who have something worth fighting for. That would be enough. Not to conquer the world, just to live. And life is the only thing he promised. Tate was silent for a long time. Then he took off his glasses, wiped them, put them back on, and said quietly he'd been looking for the right person for 40 years, and he'd found him. Precisely because Dan had refused, the right person is the one who doesn't take the power offered to him. Dan looked at him, asked, "What about the accident, his death, his past life?" Tate didn't look away, said, "He did what he considered necessary. One life for thousands. Arithmetic, the very kind that Dan understands better than anyone." Dan clenched his fists under the table. Then he unclenched them, slowly. He said, he doesn't forgive, but he won't seek revenge either. Because revenge is an expense that yields no profit. And because the boy in this body, his grandson, the one Dan never knew, he'd like someone to keep living, instead of wasting time on the dead. Tate nodded. He stood up. He walked toward the door. He paused. He said, "The system won't be completely deactivated. The fighters will leave. The resources will dry up, but the knowledge will remain. The blueprints, the technology, all the information the system provided is forever in the minds of Dan's people. That can't be taken away. It's his." Tate left. He got into the helicopter. The helicopter took off and flew east. Dan never saw him again. The system window flashed one last time. Status. Carnadon, ruler of the Confederation. Confirm. Reject. Dan clicked reject. The window flickered, flared up, went dark. Forever. All over Ashford, system soldiers began to vanish. Quietly, without flashes, without a sound, they simply dissolved into thin air. Grant stood in the square and watched as his ranks melted away. He turned to Dan, saluted, and he was the last to vanish. Silence. The square is empty. Uniforms lie on the ground. Weapons lie on the ground. 500 assault rifles, thousands of rounds of ammunition, radios, binoculars, everything remains. The people are gone. Dan stood in the middle of the square. Residents were gathering around him. Real people, alive, frightened. They had seen the soldiers vanish. They didn't understand what had happened. They looked at Dan. They waited. Dan looked at them, at their faces. Familiar, every single one, by name. Malik with the hammer, Knox with the crooked nose, Frank with the calloused hands, Patty with the flour-stained hands, Leo with the notebook, Curtis with the kids,
Willie, the skinhead foreman, Evelyn in her cracked glasses, Ji-Yun with oily hands, Sarah with tired eyes, Mika with a scar across her eyebrow, Hannah, small and quiet, Beck, upright and unyielding, Ruth, Tyrone, Victor, Cole, Dorian, Burke. Hundreds of faces, 1,200 people, Dan said. The soldiers left, but we stayed. The weapons remained. The walls remained. The mill and the bakery and the infirmary and the school remained. The fields remained. The grain is growing. Bread is being baked. Water is flowing. Nothing we built with our own hands has gone anywhere. Beck will teach anyone who wants to handle a weapon. Ji-Yun will fix anything that breaks. Sarah will heal anyone who gets sick. Hannah will feed anyone who is hungry. Evelyn will teach every child to read. And tomorrow is planting time. The southern fields. We need to check the seeds. We have a lot of work to do. Silence. A long silence. Then Willie stepped forward. He picked up an assault rifle from the ground, slung it over his shoulder. He said, "I'm taking the south wall. Who's with me?" Knox stepped forward. Then Victor. Then Cole. Then Malik. Then 10 more, and more, and more, one after another. They picked up their weapons. They formed a line, not even, not pretty, a crooked line of farmers and former gangsters and students and cooks and mothers, but a line. Beck looked at them. Then she straightened up. She walked over to the line. She stood in front of it. She said loudly, "The Carnarvon Confederation Militia, first muster. Sort yourselves out into tens. The senior members report to me in 5 minutes." And she got to work. Dan stood and watched. Then he walked over to the wall. He sat down on a crate. He opened his notebook, the very one Evie had bound. He wrote, "Day 221. The system is down. The fighters are gone. The weapons remain. The militia is being formed. Beck is in command. Today's tasks? Planting in the southern fields. Check the seeds. Remind Hannah about the children's rations. Stop by to see Sarah. Her back hurts. Talk to Beck about veterans' pensions. The Confederation's first newspaper. Leo is the editor-in-chief. Talk to him today." He closed his notebook. He looked up. He gazed at the sky. Clear. Blue. Truly blue for the first time in 20 years. The acid clouds had drifted north. The wind had shifted. The sun shone brightly and simply, just like in Evelyn's children's drawings. Dan stood up. He climbed down from the crate. He walked down the street, past the bakery, which smelled of bread, past the school, from which children's voices could be heard, past the infirmary, where Sarah was already working, past the workshop, where Ji-Yun was already soldering, past the kitchen, where Hannah was already cooking, past the wall, where Beck was organizing the militia, past the field, where Frank was already inspecting the soil, past the people who nodded at him and said, "Good morning, Dan," and he nodded back and said, "Good morning," to everyone, by name. He walked through the town he had built, not with a sword, not with magic, not with a system, with a notebook, a to-do list, and 3 questions. What's your name? How old are you? What can you do? That was all. It turned out to be enough.